See You at the House, a collection of family memories, written by Dr. Jerry Byrne McKenney, read by Amy Kamer. Howdy, my name is Amy Kamer, and welcome to the audiobook of See You at the House by Dr. Jerry Byrne McKenney. This is a collection of short, true stories and remembrances written by my maternal grandfather. Now, since I always called Dr. McKenney Poppy, I'll be referring to him as Poppy henceforth and forthwith in this introduction. My Poppy was born in 1926 and passed away at the age of 89 years old. At the time of this recording, it's been almost exactly 10 years since we had to say goodbye, for now, which I believe is the only fitting way to bid farewell to all who have put their faith in Jesus as Poppy did. My Poppy was a man whose life was defined indelibly by his unwavering faith in Jesus Christ. His Savior, as found in the Bible, was his North Star. Poppy was also marked by his near lifelong romance of his wife, my Nana. He only made it 14 days this side of heaven without her, when she preceded him in going to the everlasting arms. He was characterized by his devotion to his children, tender love for his grandchildren, and his service to his country and his community as a medical doctor. Poppy's love for healing even extended to several other nations where he served faithfully as a medical missionary. Growing up, my Poppy, his stories, his work, his adventures, and his life loomed so large in my imagination that he became a figure of near mythic proportion. As a child, Poppy's family stories took up so much space on the bookshelf of my mind that the exploits of my ancestors, such as the many stunts of Uncle Doc, especially the one about his pet reticulated python, and Poppy's Cajun feast showdown, these stories carried equal importance in my heart as the tales of Jack and the Beanstalk, John Henry, and Paul Bunyan and his babe. For me, feeding that larger-than-life perception I had of Poppy was the fact that we lived nearly 4 hours away. I loved him dearly, and I never doubted his great and sweet love for me, but I didn't have the cuddly, familiar access to him that I envied greatly of my cousins that got to live local to him. It was a hardship and a heartache, truly, growing up without either set of grandparents nearby. As I reflected on what to say in this introduction, and after reading and rereading the source material to prepare, I realized something of a comfort. If Poppy and I had the chance to have the cuddly, super familiar relationship that I coveted and still do more in the absence of, there's the distinct possibility he may have become humdrum to me. Poppy may have lost his mythic glamour in my mind, and the larger-than-life stories from his life, the lives of our ancestors, may have been lost in my heart forever. Perhaps if I had had him close by like I wished, these stories I'm about to share would have been drowned out by familiarity, which I'm told can breed contempt. And if I don't remember Poppy and the other long-gone McKenneys, how will my son, Roman, remember? Roman, my Poppy's great-grandson, who he didn't live to meet, but the child my Poppy faithfully prayed the Lord would give me. How will he remember? And how will Roman's, God willing, his future children remember? As it is, Roman does remember. He remembers a man he's never met, who has captured his wonder, imagination, and admiration right along with Jack and his Beanstalk. Because Roman has heard Poppy's true stories. I hope you'll enjoy them as much as we always have, and I'm thankful to share them with you here, where hopefully they'll have a better chance of being remembered. If you stay tuned to the very end, you can also enjoy a closing written and read by my mother, Mary Ford McKenney Fallhaber, who, as you remember, was Poppy's daughter and knew him much more intimately than myself. Before we dive in and get to what we're all actually here to listen to, I do have 2 items of housekeeping to address with you. First, I hope you'll have grace for me, as I'm sure I will fumble pronunciations of names, places, and items. There are few left alive in my family who remember those details from experience. I'm also an amateur audiobook recording artist, so if I stumble, bumble, and fumble along the way, we are just going to keep on moving, friends. Though the perfectionist in me will be screaming, we ain't got the skill or time up in this closet to fix it. And now for the next and final item of business, I need you to know that from childhood, my Poppy lived a very racially integrated life. Despite growing up amidst the evils of Jim Crow Kentucky, my Poppy was taught the biblical truth by his parents that every person, no matter the color of their skin, was an equal image bearer of God, equally valuable, equally precious in his sight, and therefore worthy of respect, love, and neighborliness. Those are principles Poppy took to heart and lived out exceedingly well, both at home and in his medical mission work, serving our brothers and sisters in Haiti and in Sudan. And even so, some of his words, some of his descriptions in this book of African American people are frowned upon in our day. No, I'm not talking about that word, which has never been polite or loving or in society as a whole. However, because Poppy lived an integrated life, loving all those around him long before others did, his use of terms like colored or Negro and his stories about his friends and acquaintances fall upon our modern ears very rudely. I fully acknowledge that, and if my inclusion of reading these terms as Poppy wrote them offends any of you, dear listeners, I truly apologize. I read these terms as Poppy wrote them, never without care of offending, but because at the time he wrote them, they were the expressions that were considered socially polite, kind, and neighborly. And after much consideration, I chose to leave them and read them as they were written in an effort to preserve this time capsule of American history. I also acknowledge that at the time of this recording, even though I am using the current, socially polite, kind, and neighborly term African Americans, 6 months from now or 60 years from now, my listeners may be disturbed to hear the terms I use. That's the unfortunate nature of language. It changes with lightning speed. And for all that, I hope you'll hear my Poppy's heart of love for all his fellow man and mine as well within these stories. The only exception when I will self-censor is when I get to Poppy's story, Curtis Parker and Our Clinkers. In this story, Poppy does use the N-word, but only because he is giving a direct quote from an African-American friend, a quote I believe is extremely important. Not just historically important, which it is, but it's important because it was a heart-wrenching, honest, and anxious thought that Poppy's friend was expressing, and Mr. Curtis Parker's thoughts and memory mattered to me. I'll draw this conversation to a close by bringing attention to perhaps the saddest memory in this collection. When we get to his story, Lizzie's Goodbye, you'll see as a young man, Poppy had one regret in this regard of equality, one that instantly filled him with remorse for not doing better. Now, in the grand scheme of American racial tension, when we get there, it may seem small to you what happened in this story, especially when compared with the greater context of Poppy's legacy of loving all people so exceedingly well. However, it's a story that broke his heart to write, and my heart hurts reading it. And even with the intensified racial turmoil we've experienced in this first half of the 2020s, I chose to include it because Poppy did. He included it because he wanted us to learn from his mistake that brought him sorrow. I'm proud of Poppy, not just for writing about his best side, but being honest about his shortcoming as well. And I'm thankful to include Lizzie's Goodbye and hopes it is a benefit to all as a learning opportunity, because Poppy learned a lot from it. And now, I'm grateful to present the audiobook of See You at the House by Dr. Jerry Byrne McKenney, beginning with his short introduction. All people are interesting, and all people do and say things that are significant, or amusing, or both. The problem is that my memory is not nearly as good as we could wish, and lots of really good anecdotes get lost and forgotten, which is a shame. My daughter, Mary McKenney Faulhaber, asked me to record some of the stories she heard us tell about people in the family as she was growing up. I am happy to please her. And also I see the wisdom of recording these bits of family heritage and humor, so I will try to remember and record as many as I can. There will be many that escape me, and I really regret that. I wish that the idea had come up many years ago, but all we can do today is what we can do today. Maybe some of the lost stories will occur to some one of us as time goes on and can be added to the collection later. I don't plan to try to arrange the stories in any particular order. This will just be a collection of stories, some related to others and some isolated events that I will record as they come to mind. I hope that others in the family can harvest a part of their heritage, a lot of good fun, and even a few tears from these accounts. Jerry B. McKenney, M.D., Sturgis, Kentucky, May 14th, 1992. A smallpox clinic in Bloody Breathitt. My mother had an older sister named Beulah. We always called her Aunt Boo. It probably started when one of us was just learning to talk, and it stuck for the rest of her life. Anyway, Aunt Boo married a physician named Lucius Ernest Smith that we children all called Uncle Doc. Aunt Boo and Uncle Doc met when Uncle Doc was attending the University of Kentucky. My grandmother's family lived in Lexington. Aunt Boo was a teacher at Morton High School, and she met Uncle Doc at a Christian Endeavor meeting. They were engaged soon after, but couldn't get married until Uncle Doc finished his education. After UK, he went to Johns Hopkins School of Medicine in Baltimore, Maryland. Then he went to Puerto Rico for his internship, and finally 1 3-year tour as a medical missionary in Spanish West Africa. After all that, they were married after being engaged for 13 years. For people who really intend to get married, that should constitute a record of some sort. They were married on his furlough and then went back to Africa together. They were in Africa during World War I, and before that term was over, Aunt Boo had a very severe case of rheumatic fever, which gravely damaged her heart. She survived to be an old lady, but her heart condition made them unable to return to the mission field in Africa. Uncle Doc had gone to college and medical school for the specific purpose of being a missionary physician, and he felt that he should not go into private practice, but should seek some area of public service for using his training. He looked into public health and became the first ever public health officer in Breathitt County, Kentucky. In those days, they were still actively feuding in Breathitt County, and it was referred to as Bloody Breathitt. Smallpox was a very real threat then, and Uncle Doc soon had a campaign going to vaccinate as many people in the county as possible. Part of that campaign was to go to all the schools in the county and vaccinate the school children. One of the schools was at the head of a long holler. When he got to the school and checked the notes from parents, he found that support for his program was by no means universal. There was one note that read, "If you vaccinate my kids, I'll kill you when you come back down the holler." He vaccinated all the children anyway, which shows that malpractice suits were not common in that day. Then he began to think about getting home safely. He knew enough about mountain people by then to know that they were greatly impressed by demonstrations of sheer, cold nerve. It was warm weather, and he soon found a large rattlesnake and caught the snake. Then he put his equipment in his saddlebags, grasped the snake behind the head, climbed on his horse, and rode off down the holler with the snake in his hand. No one attempted to harm him in any way, and he arrived home safely with a new pet. I knew Uncle Doc well enough to not be surprised that he would catch a rattlesnake and use it to intimidate the father who objected to having his children vaccinated. He was a small man, but filled with determination. What I still can't figure out is how he was able to make the horse allow him to ride with that snake in his hand. I was thrown by our horse Fancy once, when the wind rattled a dry corn shuck and there wasn't a snake in sight. I know what happened, though. At Uncle Doc's retirement dinner, I talked about his replacement at the Kentucky Tuberculosis Association, where he spent most of his professional lifetime. I don't remember the man's name, but I remember him telling me that he was raised in a holler in Breathitt County and could remember one time, when he was about 10 years old, seeing a man riding down the holler on a big brown horse with a big rattlesnake in his hand. Before I leave this tale, I want to tell you about the fate of the rattlesnake. Uncle Doc kept the snake in a cage and fed it mice from time to time. The cage was in an open back porch of the house. That fall, after it was somewhat cool but not really cold, Uncle Doc caught a rat in a cage trap. He was about to dump the rat cage trap into a bucket of water, which was the standard method of dispatching the rat in those circumstances. Just before he immersed the rat, he remembered that it had been some time since he had fed the snake. So he emptied the live rat into the snake's cage, closed the door, and went to the house. He heard the snake rattling a lot, and then it got quiet. Some time later, he passed through the porch, checked the snake cage, and found nothing in the cage except one rat. Who do you love? When I was quite small, maybe 3 or 4 years old, my family lived in Lexington, Kentucky. My mother and father both came from fairly large families, and so there was lots of aunts around to spoil a blonde-haired little boy. I'm told that I was greatly attached to anything that belonged to my father, who traveled for the Ag College of the University of Kentucky, and so wasn't home very much. My grandmother made my shirts from the tails of Daddy's old shirts, and I was very proud of those shirts and insisted that the pocket be made from the part of the shirt tail with the printing on it. In those days, the information that would be on the label today was printed on the left front shirt tail, and I apparently knew that if this area was displayed on the shirt pocket, everyone would know that the material came from one of his shirts. I liked to wear one of those shirts, one of Daddy's ties, and one of his old fedora hats. Everyone thought I was cute in the shirt, the tie dragging on the ground, the hat down over my ears, short pants, and barefooted. My aunts used to play with me and talk to me a lot. A favorite question seems to have been, "Jerry, who do you love the most?" For some time, I didn't answer that question. Other questions were answered, but not that one. Naturally, the question I wouldn't answer got more and more frequently. Someone, I think Aunt B, finally pinned me to the wall and demanded an answer. After some thought, I told her, "I don't tell my insides to nobody." Small children sometimes exhibit more wisdom than we might think they would. The Aunt B I mentioned was my father's stepsister, and that makes a little story of its own. Daddy's mother had a young brother, Albert McKenney, the baby of the family, who married Aunt B. They had one child, Floyd McKenney, and then Albert died. Through that marriage, Mamaw, Daddy's mother, met Aunt B's father, Wes Brandenburg. He was a widower with 5 children, and Mamaw was a widow with 1 child, my father. Later, Mamaw and Mr. Brandenburg, we called him Papaw, were married. If you can figure out how Mamaw, and therefore all the rest of us, and Aunt B were related, you're better than I am. Mamaw's charge account. Mamaw, my father's mother, kept house and cared for her large family through plenty of times of trial and scarcity, in a time when there wasn't any such thing as social services. Papaw worked as a carpenter and made a living, but there wasn't anything much to spare. Possibly by nature, but certainly from grim necessity, Mama was extremely conservative about spending, so much that the family kidded her a lot about being so tight. There was a favorite story that certainly wasn't true, to the effect that Mama went to the grocery and while there asked the groceryman the price of eggs. He told her that they were 10 cents a dozen. You can see this was a long time ago. Then she asked him how much cracked eggs were, and he told her 7 cents a dozen. Her response then was to ask him to crack her a dozen. As I said, this didn't really happen, but they told the story so many times that I'm sure she got sick and tired of hearing it. The point is, she had spent so many years having to be tight that later, after it wasn't absolutely necessary, it was such a firm habit that it attracted a lot of attention and got her a lot of kidding. In later years, something happened that proved that living a lifetime with no possibility of using credit makes it difficult to grasp even the concept of credit. Somewhere along the way, long after the kids all moved out and the family was down to just Mama and Papa, she had a charge account. Someone noticed that when she was in the store where she had a charge account and so didn't have to pay cash on the spot, she seemed to spend rather recklessly. When someone finally asked her why her spending habits had changed so radically, she replied, "What do I care for expense as long as I'm not out anything?" Grandma's television. Grandma Lips, my mother's mother, lived to be 94 years old, and her mind was excellent right up to the end. Maybe it was a little too good. Just shortly before she died, she had an episode of mild congestive heart failure. The episode was mild enough that her physician, Dr. Moore, cared for her at home. After about 10 days, she was feeling much better, and she was up and about the house, and Dr. Moore made the mistake of telling her that she had heart failure. Apparently, she decided that having heart failure at age 94 meant it was time to go to a better place. She went back to bed that day and died 6 weeks later, in spite of continuing to take all of her medicine. Her name was Emma Tabitha, was a very strong-willed woman. Grandma had 1 son and 5 daughters. One daughter had a cerebral hemorrhage at age 3 during an episode of whooping cough, was handicapped and never left home. That was Aunt Esther. Aunt Bethel also never left home. 3 of her sisters were married before she was, and she decided that she would stay at home to earn a living for Grandma and Aunt Esther. She was a strong-willed woman, too, and made her boyfriend very sad because she was very pretty and, as a young woman, also she was an excellent cook, which he probably knew, too. When Grandma was in her late 70s and 80s, her son, Uncle Wilbur, who was in the furniture business, got her a nice television set. She enjoyed the television because she rarely left the house and was particularly fond of the news programs. Just because she didn't get out of the house very often didn't mean she lost interest in what was going on in the world. You could count on the television set being turned on for the news morning and evening. Aunt Bethel worked as a secretary at the University of Kentucky, but had plenty to do around the house, too, with Aunt Esther handicapped and Grandma getting older. She would get up in the morning, get all ready to go to work except putting on her dress, and then would work around the house in her slip, so that her dress would be nice and fresh when she went to work. If her work brought her into the living room, Grandma would remonstrate with her for running around like that in front of those nice young men. The nice young men were the announcers on the news broadcasts that she was watching at the time of the day. All of us, at one time or another, would explain to her that the people she could see on the television set couldn't see the people in the room with the television set, and so Aunt Bethel wasn't really running around in her slip in front of those nice young men. We were fighting a losing battle. Grandma was born in 1864, 1 year before the Civil War was over. She had seen civilization go from horses, which she loved dearly, to cars, then airplanes, and then could accept all that comfortably, but she just couldn't get the concept of television straight in her mind. She understood movies with a projector and a screen. So we would tell her the television was the same, except that the projector and the screen are both in that cabinet together, and those nice young men were no more a part of her environment than actors in a movie. When she had heard all that story that she intended to put up with, she would say, "Jonan, I know they can't really see us, but I can't help feeling like they do." Uncle Doc's pet python. Some people like fuzzy rabbits, some like poodle dogs. Different people have very different preferences when it comes to pets. Uncle Doc, my mother's sister's husband, liked snakes. He wouldn't have a dog or a cat on the place, but he really liked snakes. When he was a health officer in Breathitt County, Kentucky, he had several rattlesnakes. He kept them in cages and never let them run loose in the house, but he really liked them and enjoyed keeping them and caring for them. Before he was a health officer in Breathitt County, he was a missionary physician in the Spanish West Africa, and he did have a snake for a house pet there. He found a python egg, or someone gave him one, while he was in Africa. As I recalled it, I believe he told me once that he was hunting, killed an adult python, and found the nest with eggs, and took one home with him. At any event, he wound up with a python egg in his house at the mission station. He managed to incubate the egg, it hatched, and he raised the snake in the house, and it was never anywhere but in the house. The snake probably thought it was a person, as the only home it ever knew was that house, and the only relationships it ever had were with Uncle Doc and Aunt Boo. I knew that snakes object to eating anything they haven't caught and killed themselves, and I asked Uncle Doc how he fed the snake. He told me he had to force feed the snake by forcing its mouth open and placing meat in its mouth. Once the mass of meat was in the snake's mouth, its teeth slanted to the rear, and an ingathering motion of the lower jaw made swallowing a matter of reflexes the snake couldn't or wouldn't control. Of course, that made it crucial to not let your hand get entangled with those rear-facing teeth, along with the mass of meat you wanted the snake to eat, especially after the snake was about 10 feet long. Uncle Doc and Aunt Boo told me that the creature seemed to enjoy their company and really made a nice pet, but you have to remember not to let any part of your body get inside its mouth. This occurred during the First World War, and Germany was our enemy. It so happened that the only other white person near enough to them for easy visiting was a German who is single and had only Africans for company. This German was lonely and came to visit them frequently. He told them that there was no fighting in that area and that he saw no reason that they could not have a pleasant social arrangement and leave politics out of the conversation. This was difficult to argue against, and they felt sorry for the man, who seemed very nice, so they agreed with him, and his visits continued. After a while, Aunt Boo and Uncle Doc began to feel a bit guilty about this fraternization with this man from Germany, the enemy of their country, the good old USA. This created a real problem for them because the man was really so nice, and they hated to say anything that would hurt his feelings. Finally, they hit upon the idea of releasing this snake in the house while this man was sitting in a comfortable armchair visiting with them. Uncle Doc and Aunt Boo continued conversing with him, saying nothing about the snake. After a while, the snake, who was about 10 feet long by that time, wandered quietly into the room, noticed the visitor, and being curious about this stranger, moved over to the side of the chair and raised its head up to the height of the visitor's face, looking at the visitor. After a few moments, the poor German sensed that someone or something was very close and turned to look to see what was there. Of course, he found himself nose to nose with the friendly python. Without a word, the poor man jumped up, bolted away through the screen door without bothering to open it, and disappeared up the trail toward his home, running madly, which was something he had not been known to do before. And he never came back. That's not the whole story of the python who thought it was a person. Aunt Boo and Uncle Doc were forced to leave the mission field because Aunt Boo developed rheumatic fever with severe rheumatic heart disease. Uncle Doc felt that the snake, which had never been in the wild at all, might not be able to survive if he just turned it loose into the jungle. So he took the snake along when they went on the boat to return to the U.S. He had a large bag, which they called a valise, which opened at the top and was wide at the bottom, and the snake rather nicely filled the valise. Uncle Doc just hand-carried that valise with the snake inside all the way home to Kentucky. They finally arrived in Lexington, Kentucky, at the home of Grandma Lips, after the long ocean voyage and a stop at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore, Maryland, to try to get Aunt Boo cared for. They moved their things into the front bedroom downstairs because of Aunt Boo's heart trouble, and Uncle Doc slid the valise with the snake far back under the bed and said nothing about the snake at all. He knew better than to mention the snake because he was well aware that Grandma Lips had an absolute phobia against snakes. Grandma's house had a wide yard that was quite deep, about 200 feet from the curb at the back fence. I remember once as a child playing in the back corner of the yard and noticing a small green snake, a perfectly harmless creature, and later mentioning the fact to Grandma. She immediately armed herself with a long-handled hoe, marched to the back fence, searched carefully until she found that little green snake and hoed it good. I guess you would say bad if you were the snake. The python rested comfortably under the bed for about 3 days, and all seemed well. And then Uncle Doc came into the house from somewhere or other, and Grandma met him and spoke to him in a very forceful tone of voice. This is what she said. "Ernest, I don't know what is in that valise under the bed, but if what I think is in there really is in there, you had best see that I don't ever know of it." Uncle Doc was a brave and determined little man, but he wasn't foolish. The very next day, he took the train to Cincinnati, Ohio, and where there was an excellent zoo, and took the valise with him. He gave the snake to the zoo, valise and all, and went back to Lexington and had a long and pleasant relationship with his mother-in-law. The snake was about 18 feet long when he gave it to the zoo. This was before I was born, but I can remember being taken to the Aunt Bertie's medicine. My father's mother, Mama Brandenburg, had one sister, Aunt Bertie, and they were always very close. Even after Aunt Bertie moved to Tampa, Florida, to live with her son, Jack, she would come to Winchester, Kentucky, several times a year to visit. Mama and I remember Cousin Jack well. He was in real estate in Tampa and arranged for the Efficiency apartment where we spent our honeymoon in Clearwater Beach, Florida. That is a good story, too, that I will have to tell sometime. Aunt Bertie had some long-lasting but obscure illness when she was a young woman. Apparently it was never specifically diagnosed, and nothing the doctor did for her seemed to help. This went on for months, and the end result was that she was slowly but steadily losing weight and becoming weaker. Finally, the doctor told her that if she expected to live, she would have to reverse this weight loss problem by drinking 2 bottles of beer a day. The whole family, including Aunt Bertie and Mama, were strong Baptists, and so this was ugly news indeed. However, Aunt Bertie was much too young to die, and they didn't know of any other way to help her. So she got the beer, and she started trying to drink her 2 bottles a day. It was a terrible problem. The stuff tasted terrible, and 2 bottles of it was a real trial to consume every day. She started out holding her nose, and she gagged a lot, but she was much too young to die, so she persisted. Finally, though, she reached a point where her persistence paid off, and she didn't gag anymore. She still had to hold her nose when she drank it, but she didn't gag anymore. And she did begin to gain a little weight, and her weakness improved. Finally, she didn't even have to hold her nose. It was all downhill from that point. Her weight got back to normal, her strength was good, and she later married and produced Cousin Jack. When I remember Aunt Bertie, she was in her late 50s, 60s, and 70s, was almost as wide as she was tall, and she was still putting down 2 bottles of beer every day, no more, no less. I can remember Mama looking really peeved and saying, "Oh, Bertie." And Aunt Bertie would smile and say, "Doctor's orders," and down her beer with obvious pleasure. After all, even at that age, she was still too young to die. Lizzie's Goodbye. When I was growing up on Bell Court East in Lexington, Kentucky, my mother was blessed by having a really sweet colored lady to help her with her housework. Lizzie came to our back door one day. It must have been during hard times, but I was much too young to remember that sort of detail. Lizzie was going from house to house asking for work. Those were the days when segregation was still rigid in our area, which is why Lizzie came to the back door rather than the front. She was small, neat-appearing, and pleasant, and Mother was attracted to her and asked her to come back one day a week. That began a long and pleasant arrangement that lasted many years, until Lizzie was somewhat elderly and had an opportunity to work full-time as a companion for a lady she had helped for years, just as she had helped Mother. Lizzie's full name was Elizabeth Clayton. She had been married, but her husband died not long after they were married. She didn't have any children, so Lizzie lived alone in a small frame house in the colored part of town for the rest of her life and never remarried. She earned her own living doing housework and owned the little house where she lived. Lizzie had a sister, Florence, who lived on the same street, who had plenty of children, and Lizzie spent a lot of her hard-earned money helping Florence. Lizzie would always get her winter's supply of coal in the yard and paid for long before winter each year. Then, along in January or February, Florence, who didn't prepare in advance, would be in difficulty, and Lizzie would have to share her coal supply. It really worried her because it would be hard to find more money for coal if she ran out, but I can see her shaking her head and saying, "Those little children, you know." What all this boils down to is that Lizzie Clayton was a sweet, hard-working little lady who always paid her bills and was always ready to share with people in need, even when sharing meant real hardship for her. She was a faithful church member and lived out her Christian faith when it required real faith to do so. Lizzie only came to our house one day a week, but soon she seemed like a member of our family. We loved her, and I know that she loved us too. I know this with total certainty because of what happened when I went away to the Army in World War II. By that time, we lived in the house in Kingsway Drive, where Mother and Daddy both later died, and instead of a little boy, I was 18 years old. I was 18 on January 11th, and I left for the Air Corps on January 17th. Lizzie was there that day, and I clearly remember her calling me upstairs away from everyone else to tell me goodbye. I don't remember what she said, but I remember that she kissed me, but instead of kissing me on the cheek, she kissed me on the back of my neck. Segregation was such a truly terrible thing. Lizzie always used the back door, never the front door, and when she told me goodbye, she would not kiss me on the cheek, but on the back of my neck, and she did that away from everyone else. It makes me weep to remember that day. I have wished so many times that I had put my arms around her and told her how much I would miss her, but I didn't. I know that I said something appropriate, but I wish now that I had done so much more. My consolation, as I remember, is the certain knowledge that Lizzie and Mother and Daddy are all waiting for me in heaven, and I will have more than enough opportunity to say all the things I didn't manage to say then. And Lizzie will smile, her quiet little smile, and say, "Oh, that's all right, Jerry." Theological compromise, then and now. My father and his family were Baptists. At least, they were as far back as we know. The family was originally Scotch-Irish, having migrated from Scotland to Dublin, Ireland, and then to the United States. This being true, they were probably originally Roman Catholics who were driven out of Scotland by the predominant Presbyterianism there. Somewhere along the way, though, the family became solidly Baptist. Mother was raised a Presbyterian as the result of a theological compromise, not heritage. Her father, Jonas Alexander Lips, was raised a Baptist. Her mother, Emily Tabitha Chase Lips, was raised a Methodist. Neither of them could freely accept the other's religious persuasion, so they compromised and raised their children in the Presbyterian Church. I don't believe either of the parents changed their membership, but they all attended church together, and the children all eventually were members of the Presbyterian Church. Mother and Daddy had a similar problem, and they compromised by raising us children in Central Christian Church on Short Street in Lexington, Kentucky. Neither of them ever changed their membership, but Mother took us to Sunday school and church. She would usually take us to Sunday school, go home, and then come back and go to church with us. Daddy was usually away from home, and when he was home, he usually stayed at home, saying that he was away from home so much that he hated to leave the house when he was in town. I really don't know if that was the literal truth, or if he was reluctant to attend the Christian church, but didn't go to Calvary Baptist to avoid putting any pressure on Mother. In any event, I grew up in the Christian church and still worship and work there today. After we children were all grown, Mother started going to the Maxwell Street Presbyterian Church again. Both my sisters and my brother eventually became Presbyterians, but I remained in the Christian church, and this is how I happened to be raised in that church. The really interesting thing, though, is the difference in attitudes that one generation can make. The theological compromise of raising us children in the Christian church never caused any stress in our family that we were aware of. There may have been a little stress for Daddy, but if so, we were never made aware of it. For Mother's family, it was radically different. Grandma and Grandpa Lips didn't have any stress, but their parents experienced great stress. In those days, the members of different denominations didn't view the members of other denominations as Christians. Mother could remember both of her grandfathers, gray-haired old men with long white beards and big black Bibles, coming repeatedly with tears in their eyes, pleading with their grandchildren to leave that false faith of Presbyterianism and come back to the true faith, Baptist or Methodist, as the case may be. Those old men were totally sincere. They loved their grandchildren and wanted them to be saved so that they could be with them for eternity in heaven. And they were certain that being Presbyterian did not mean being saved. As a matter of interest, the Christian church that my parents' compromise chose came into being as an attempt to do away with divisive denominationalism. The early leaders of the Christian church, the Restoration movement, came from Baptist, Methodist, and Presbyterian backgrounds. Unfortunately, human nature doesn't change much. Instead of doing away with denominations, the Restoration movement has effectively added 3 more to the list: Disciples of Christ, Christian Church, and Church of Christ. I rejoice that society has learned to be more tolerant in our day. I differ on what I consider to be very important points of theology with Roman Catholics, Baptists, Methodists, and Presbyterians, not to mention other less prominent branches of Christianity. However, because I believe that Romans 14 teaches that God doesn't require us to be perfect in our understanding of Him, but does require us to be honest and practice what we really believe, I can view the members of all Christian groups as my brothers and sisters in Christ, and I hope that they view me in the same tolerant light. John's yard fence. My firstborn, John, was barely 2 years old when we first moved to Sturgis. We rented a house from Dr. Carr's wife on Talbot Street. It was a nice house with a large yard, but Talbot Street was a part of the route of huge coal trailer trucks, hauling coal from one of the mines to a barge loading facility on Tradewater River. There were lots of those huge trucks, often 2 or 3 in a row, and they moved at a good speed. The entire rig, loaded, weighed over 30 tons, much too heavy to stop suddenly if a little boy ran out in front of one. About the 3rd day we were there, Betty told me that she knew I was busy setting up the office and all, but that she had to have a fence around the backyard so that John would be able to play outside where he couldn't be in danger of winding up in front of a coal truck. She promised not to ask for anything else if I would just take care of a backyard fence. That made total sense to me, so I went off to the hardware store for a roll of fence wire and a stack of iron posts and went to work. As usual, I was trying to do something I had never done before with totally inadequate tools. I got everything laid out and then started driving the first post. I was standing on a kitchen chair driving the post with an axe. I was making progress, but not much speed. Before I could finish driving that first post, I looked across the driveway toward our neighbor down the street and saw a short, overweight man headed my way with a short stepladder on one shoulder and a sledgehammer in his other hand. That little man came up, didn't even tell me his name or ask mine, but set down the ladder and hammer and said, "I've come to help you build your fence." And that's how I met Mr. Frank Bush, my neighbor and first real friend in Sturgis. He was retired in his early 70s from his job as a boss of the railroad shop at Poplar Ridge Mine. He had a shop in his garage and loved to garden, and we got along just fine. And the difference in our ages didn't even seem to matter. We lived there about 3 years, and Mr. Bush and I had several projects together. But I remember a boat that he had that we rigged up for a mobile duck blind and then never hunted out of, but whatever we had going on, we enjoyed. He only lived a few more years, but he was always the pleasant, effective little man who came to help me build John's fence. Jim's bird dog. I really like dogs, and I particularly like hunting dogs because I enjoy watching them work. One of the prettiest sights I know is to see one dog on a solid point, with 2 or 3 other good dogs scattered out backing the first dog. I really like watching the dogs, better than I do shooting the birds, at least until the birds come out of the skillet. I have owned one really good dog. He was an orange and white pointer I bought from Joe Mackey. John was in the 1st grade when I brought the pup home, and we told him he could name our new pet. John's 1st grade teacher had a story about a little boy with a dog named Jip, so he named our dog Jip. We registered him as Max Jip, which was fine, until I started hunting him with other people. The common, polite term for a female dog is to call her a Jip. Our Jip was very definitely a male, and I got a lot of strange looks from hunting partners when I started trying to call in my dog. Odd name or not, old Jip was a really fine bird dog. He was hard-headed, but after I would call him in and scold him, he would settle down and work like a field trial dog the rest of the day. He had a good nose for birds, and he was really smart. He seemed to know what the birds would do, and would anticipate them. A really fine dog. His only fault was his tendency to hunt wide, a common problem with pointers, and he would often point out of my sight, and it could take some time to find him. The longest he ever held birds for me was about 45 minutes, and when I found him, I saw him break point, back up about 20 feet, circle wide, and point in the opposite direction. The birds had started to run out from under his point, and he circled them and headed them off without flushing them. Like I said, that Jip was one fine bird dog. He was my dog, too, and I liked to be spoiled. At the end of a long, hard day of hunting, he wanted to ride in the front seat with me. He would lay on his back with his head in my lap all the way home. I had been hunting with Lawrence Travis down at Maple Sink one day, and he showed me a dog he had, also a male orange and white pointer, and told me he wanted to give me the dog because he would make a pretty pair with Jip. So I took the dog home with me. Jim, our youngest son, didn't have a pet, and the only one of the children who didn't have a pet, so we decided that the new bird dog would be Jim's pet. Because the dog was to be his pet, Jim had the privilege of naming him. Jim thought about that for a couple of days and then told me that he had picked out a name. At that point in time, Jim had a severe speech problem that made it very difficult for him to enunciate consonants. Treatment later completely cleared his problem, but it was still a large problem at that time. When I asked him what he had named the dog, I thought he said Mac. I remember thinking that it was nice that Jim was naming the dog for our family, and said, "Fine, Jim, Mac is a nice name." He immediately responded, "No, his name is Mac." We went round that 2 or 3 times, and Jim finally said, Mac, like Macwell Mart. Back then, we liked to watch a very silly and very funny show on television called Get Smart. The leading character was a bumbling secret agent named Maxwell Smart. So much for the family pride and dignity, but the dog was named Max. There's an interesting side light on this story. Max had lots of excellent qualities for a bird dog, except one. He was gun shy. When the first shot was fired, Max spent all the rest of the day so close to my heels that I had to be careful not to kick him when I picked my foot up to take a step forward. After several years, he finally began to point usefully. It was the funniest point you can imagine. He knew that the point would result in shooting, so his intense sadness at the prospect of gunfire would show in his point. Instead of standing up, he would sort of hunker down with his head down, and instead of up and his tail almost touching the ground, he would point one covey and then hunt singles for me, but his heart wasn't in it. And he mostly just stayed fairly close to me. That turned out to be a real help. When old Jip was lost and on a point, and we were looking for him, I would keep an eye on Max. When he started looking sad with his head and tail down, I knew that Jip was close and started looking in every ditch and behind every bush. It took several years, but Max and Jip finally did make a really nice hunting pair. Jealous pets. Aunt Boo, her name was Beulah, but children can't say that, was my mother's older sister. She married a missionary physician, and they went to Spanish West Africa. Their engagement set a record of some sort. They were engaged for 13 years, but they finally did marry and went off to Africa. Aunt Boo took a lot of lace and material to use, making clothes for the children they hoped they would have while they were there. During their first term in Africa, Aunt Boo developed severe rheumatic heart disease, and they were forced to return to the U.S. permanently. And she was never well enough to have children of her own. She left most of those materials in Africa, but brought the lace back with her. Much later, when her nieces and nephews began to have children, she used the lace in beautiful christening dress, which our whole family used. Life often changes our plans, but beautiful things can still be well used. While they were in Africa, they had several pets, among them a chimpanzee they enjoyed, and this story is supposed to be about two of those pets. These two were a small monkey called a spider monkey and an equally small parrot. Apparently, they enjoyed these two creatures a great deal and so spent a lot of time with them. Eventually, they felt that these two were jealous of each other and competed for the attention of the humans. They kept the two pets on the same perch, a long pole attached to the top of a vertical stand. As they began to notice the apparent jealousy between the two, they began to fear that the monkey might do the parrot some real harm. They decided to protect the parrot by using a collar and a chain for the monkey and fixed the length of the chain so that the monkey could not quite get to the parrot's end of the perch. This allowed the parrot to be able to get beyond the reach of the monkey whenever the monkey seemed to be threatening it with harm, and the mechanism worked out very well. They could release the monkey when they were in the room with the perch, but could leave the two alone without fearing for the parrot's life and well-being. One day, while they were across the house and some distance from the perch, they heard the parrot making sounds of distress. They immediately ran into the room with the perch, but felt certain that they could not possibly get there in time to save the life of the poor parrot. They entered the room to a real surprise. There was the monkey, sitting peacefully on his end of the perch, and the poor parrot, completely naked, was sitting on its end of the perch. Instead of wringing the parrot's neck, the monkey had picked it clean of its showy feathers and released it. Who would have thought that a tiny monkey mind would have enough of an appreciation of human value systems to realize that the beautiful feathers were the parrot's principal claim to fame? Uncle Doc's first night in Africa. I've mentioned Uncle Doc several times before. He was a missionary physician and the husband of my mother's older sister. This story occurred before they were married, but after he had finished his training. He graduated from the University of Kentucky, then went to Johns Hopkins School of Medicine, and finally did his internship at San Juan, Puerto Rico. After he completed his internship, he went to Spanish West Africa for his first tour of mission duty, and this story has to do with the first few hours after he arrived in Africa for the first time. Uncle Doc chose Puerto Rico for his internship because he already agreed to go to the African mission station and knew that he would need whatever experience with tropical medicine he could get. The internship at Puerto Rico turned out to be valuable in ways he never imagined. One very important thing he learned there was the importance of human attitudes. One of the staff doctors in the hospital was the man who did the definitive work on the hookworm infestation and the illnesses associated with it, and he was famous for those discoveries. This doctor had a patient in the hospital not too long after Uncle Doc got there that he could not adequately diagnose. He worked with this lady at great length without reaching a diagnosis and finally turned her over to the interns, hoping that they could do the exhaustive workup and turn up some helpful information for him that would help the patient. They did, very quickly. A routine feces examination revealed that she had hookworm. The man who had discovered the cause of hookworm disease missed the diagnosis in a classic case of hookworm disease because, for him, interest in hookworm was in the past, and at that time his curiosity and interest had turned to other fields. Another thing he learned was that carefully laid plans may not work out. He really wasn't interested in surgery and told his mission board that he would not want to do any surgery in his clinic in Africa. They assured him that this would be no problem, as there was another mission station about 20 miles down the coast that had a surgeon, and that he could send all of his surgery there. He was happy with that arrangement and went on with his studies in the hospital at Puerto Rico. Another of the regular staff men there took an interest in him and his plans and insisted that Uncle Doc accept a book as a gift. It was a very old textbook of surgery, written before sterile surgical techniques had been perfected. This doctor told him that he might, in a primitive area, need some primitive techniques. Uncle Doc accepted the book because it was a gift, and he didn't want the older doctor to think he didn't appreciate his concern and his gift. He just stored the old book away and forgot it, and it wound up in his trunk after he packed his books and instruments to leave for Africa after his internship was completed. His internship completed, he returned to the U.S., reported to the Presbyterian Board of Foreign Missions, bid farewell to family and friends, and set out for Spanish West Africa. His destination was Fernando Po, almost exactly where the west coast of the continent of Africa makes a nearly 90-degree bend, just north of the mouth of the Congo River. It was a tiny community, close to the beach, but without any port and facilities of any sort. His ship stopped after dark and anchored about 3 miles out from the beach, where the water was deep enough for the ship to safely navigate. Then they loaded Uncle Doc and his trunk and the bags in a small boat and began to row him to the beach. This was a long, slow process, and he began to notice lights appearing on the beach. Apparently, people had noticed the ship anchored, could see the small boat slowly approaching, and had come to the beach to greet the new arrival. Uncle Doc had quite a while to think all this over as the boat approached the beach, and he was flattered and pleased that the people were expecting him and had come with lights to greet him. Before he actually reached the beach, he could see several people carrying lanterns and could see something long and flat lying on the sand among the lights. When he actually reached the beach and waded ashore, he could see that the long, flat object on the sand was a makeshift stretcher with a person lying on the stretcher. The people greeted him and they told him this person had been ill several days and was in great pain and had been carried many miles by his friends to seek help at Fernando Po Mission Station. Apparently, they had arrived just a few hours before Uncle Doc's ship had arrived, and he was in such pain that they carried him to the beach instead of waiting for Uncle Doc to walk to the mission station. Uncle Doc could then do nothing but examine the man on the stretcher by lantern light on the sand at the beach. He quickly saw that the man had classic appendicitis, with evidence of beginning perionitis, and the process was so far advanced that attempting to send him on 20 more miles would almost certainly result in advanced peritonitis and death. This was long before antibiotics, and a ruptured appendix was an almost certain death sentence. I never heard him describe his train of thought as he tried to decide what to do with an obvious case requiring immediate surgery when he had very little training in surgery beyond repairing ordinary wounds and didn't want to do any serious surgery at all. I can imagine, though, his thoughts as he agonized over what to do, and with no higher authority to which he could turn for advice and help. Finally, he remembered the ancient surgery textbook in his trunk, got it out and began to search for a way to deal with this problem there in the non-sterile sand of the beach, with only non-sterile minor surgery instruments with which to do work. He soon found how well God had cared for him and his patient far in advance. The old book contained a description of a way to operate on appendicitis without sterile techniques. It involved a procedure called marsupialization, whereby you made a small incision in the proper location, inserted a finger into the belly, and grasped the right colon close to the appendix, something that sounds difficult, but is really easy to do because of the anatomy of the wall of the colon, a structure called the tinea coli, and delivered the appendix inflamed and swollen but not ruptured to the outside. Then you sutured the colon at the base of the appendix to the skin, which sealed the abdominal cavity from further contamination and got the infected appendix outside of the body. 2 days later, when the belly cavity lining was securely stuck to the skin, the appendix could be removed with the base tied with catgut. Then, over a period of time, the colon would pull back down inside the belly cavity, the skin would cover the wound, and the patient would be alive with one firm adhesion of the proximal colon to the abdominal wall. Uncle Doc, the missionary doctor who wasn't going to do any surgery, got down on his knees there in the sand of that African beach, and by lantern light marsupialized that appendix. I don't have any idea what he used for anesthesia, probably nothing at all. The important thing was that the patient was cared for and survived. That experience showed him just how far the mission board in the U.S. was from understanding the reality of patient care in a primitive environment. 20 miles in the U.S. is a vastly different thing from 20 miles in that bush. Although he didn't really enjoy surgery, he saw that to care for the needs of his area, he would have to do surgery, and so he did. He did some cases that amazed me, but he was resourceful and dedicated, and he trusted God and forged ahead. I recall that he told me that his only anesthesia was chloroform, a very dangerous anesthetic, because the climate was too hot to permit the use of ether. This made short procedures a necessity, but he was able to do complex cases because he found that if he ignored bleeders, instead of taking time to clamp and tie them, they would stop anyway. He just put sideboards on his operating table, put a drain in the table to keep the blood off the floor, and ignored bleeders, except the very major ones. About the time I graduated from medical school, modern surgeons were talking about the advisability of ignoring small and moderate bleeders to expedite their cases. It's a pity he never published his technique. I'm not sure all of his surgical success was due to skill, though. He was working on some very tough, resilient patients. He told about one old chief that he operated on for bilateral hernias. In those days, you kept a hernia patient in bed for 10 days. A few hours after the surgery, someone ran to tell Uncle Doc that the chief had become angry with one of his wives who was waiting on him in the hospital ward, so the old man got up to beat her. Uncle Doc said it didn't seem to hinder his recovery at all. Uncle Doc was certainly an interesting man. I don't recall consciously attempting to follow in his footsteps, but I'm sure that I absorbed many useful ideas and attitudes from listening to him tell stories. He certainly demonstrated that spending your life attempting to serve and please God can make you a happy and useful person. Ham to Dulac. Over the years, as our family grew up, we had the blessing of several really wonderful trips. We saw a lot of this country, plus a little of Canada, and a fair amount of Mexico. We have always had a problem trying to decide what we liked the most, the mountains or the seacoast. Something else we noticed was that all the places we wanted to visit or revisit were a long way from our house in West Kentucky. Be that as it may, we had a lot of wonderful experiences and saw loads of interesting and beautiful places. Also, we have met some really fascinating people. Probably some of the most interesting and nicest people we got to know were some real Cajun people in the bayou country of southern Louisiana. How we got to know them is somewhat convoluted. I had a very old friend in Lexington, Kentucky, David Graves. He was an attorney, but had been in the Army with a man named Irving Blanchard. Mr. Blanchard was a Cajun from Dulac, Louisiana, a tiny fishing village by the Grand Caillou Bayou. The Cajun people still speak Creole and live a very separate community from the rest of the people in southern Louisiana. For this reason, Mr. Blanchard had a lot of trouble adjusting in the army and was often the butt of unkind humor from the other men in the outfit. David was sorry for Mr. Blanchard and befriended him. David was quite large, over 6 feet and near 300 pounds, and all the other men immediately stopped bothering Mr. Blanchard. This resulted in a lifelong friendship between the two men, which gave David an entry into the Cajun community that just wouldn't have been possible in ordinary circumstances. Because of our long friendship, David invited our family to go for a visit at Dulac, along with his family. And with this introduction, the Cajun community also made us welcome. We visited there twice with David and his family, once more by ourselves. That last time, they made us just as welcome as when we had been there with David. We had a really wonderful time there with David and his family, staying in Irving and Stella Blanchard's home. Stella was a fine cook, and David was a gourmet cook, and all the neighbors came over to see the strange foreigners. All in all, it was a delightful time. A good measure of how really nice the Cajun people are, besides being willing to put up with 11 Kentuckians, was our boat trip out to Last Island. The Blanchards took their 11 guests on their shrimp boat down to the bayou in a large sound and across the sound about 15 or 20 miles to a barrier island called Last Island. Beyond Last Island was the open Gulf, and there was a surf beach where we had a fine time. As we left the bayou that morning to start across the open sound, we encountered the Blanchards' next-door neighbors, Mr. and Mrs. Willis Domingue. They were in their shrimp boat, and they were just picking up their trawl net after their first trawl of the day. When they dumped the trawl on the rear deck, we all got over on their boat to watch. And got to help them separate the shrimp from a lot of fish and trash, which we threw overboard. About that time, both boats got underway, and we went across the water about 3 hours to Last Island. The two boats were tied together, and we had a little excitement when one of the children got against the throttle linkage of the Blanchard's boat. That was soon straightened out, and we went across the water. The Domingues had about a bushel of very small shrimp from their trawl, and on the way across the sound we all pitched in to clean that batch of shrimp, and then Stella Blanchard turned them into shrimp spaghetti. That may not sound too good to you, but I'm here to tell you it was wonderful. It was just about ready when we got to Last Island. We had a good swim on the surf beach, and then had a wonderful picnic with that spaghetti and lots of other goodies. Then we all got back on the boats, headed back across the sound and up to the bayou to Dulac. I remember that there was a storm coming up just as we neared the bayou, and Stella was praying. After we were back a day or two, we found out that Mr. and Mrs. Domingue gave up a day of fishing, their living, and operated their boat out to the island and back because they didn't want all those children to cross the sound with just that one boat, just in case something happened. They did that and didn't even say anything so that we could thank them. That is what I call really fine people. A really funny thing happened on that trip that illustrates how easy it is to forget just how we appear to other people. I mentioned that all the neighbors would wind up at the Blanchards' living room every evening. I suppose that we were just as interesting to them as they were to us. Anyway, every evening about 7 o'clock, the room would fill up with a few men and a lot of overweight women with babies on their hips, and everyone would sit and visit for a couple of hours. One night, David had fixed a bunch of shrimp, some soft-shell crabs, and all the goodies to go with them. We didn't really serve meals. David and Stella just kept loads of wonderful food on the table, and anyone who was hungry would eat whatever was ready. I love shrimp and really get excited about soft-shell crabs. I'd moved over to the table and got busy with those goodies with both hands, literally. After I had been at it for some time, one of those rare things occurred, which can happen when 15 or 20 people are all talking at once. For just a few seconds, everyone stopped talking except one of those ladies, and I could clearly hear her say, "He's slowing down." I went right on eating, but got a little more polite about it. All in all, it was a really delightful time for us and for David and his family. David knew that it was somewhat of an imposition to bring our family down there, so to show his Cajun friends how much he appreciated their hospitality, he bought a whole country ham and sent it to them. Unfortunately, because of their insular lifestyle, they didn't know about country ham and what a wonderful treat it is. David liked to do nice things for people, but he also liked to know that they appreciated what had been done for them. He sent the ham, and then he kept waiting for some word from the Blanchards about the ham, but never heard it even mentioned. He was back down there several months later for a short visit by himself, and still nobody mentioned his wonderful ham. Finally, he couldn't stand it any longer and asked them if the ham he sent them for a present had ever come, perhaps thinking it had gotten lost in the shipment. Then they seemed very embarrassed and finally told him, "Mr. Dave, your ham must have taken too long getting here. When it got here, it was all moldy and ruined, and we had to throw it in the bayou. We knew that you were trying to do something really nice for us, and we just hated to tell you." I have heard jokes told about people receiving country hams as gifts, thinking the mold on the outside meant that the ham was spoiled. But this was no joke. It actually happened, and Dave's lovely and expensive country ham wound up feeding the turtles and crabs. You might say that the bayou critters got back at us for all of them that we ate down there. Grandma Lips and Gone with the Wind. My mother's maiden name was Lips. I never saw her father. He died long before Mother and Daddy were even married. Her mother, Grandma Lips, lived to be quite old, 94, and never forgot her old home in Wise County, Virginia. She told me once that she really didn't want to leave her parents' home. She said, "my father's house," being old-fashioned, but that she finally decided that if she didn't get around to marrying Jonas Lips, he would probably marry someone else, and she couldn't stand to think about that. I still have her Bible at home, and I found an unsigned, handwritten note in the Bible. It says, "Have you yet reached a decision about the question I asked you?" I can remember her telling me that they were standing by a fence near her parents' house, and that he handed her the note. That was when she decided that it was now or never and said, "Yes." Grandma was a school teacher at the time. She had finished school herself, I don't know what grade, and was teaching and living in her parents' home. Interestingly enough, she met my grandfather when he was going to school, and he was the teacher. Later, he went to another school, and she became a teacher in the same school she had attended. She commuted to school on a horse with a side saddle and loved to tell about riding that horse. Once, she heard a panther scream on a hill, and then every so often she would hear the cat squall again and could tell that the cat was keeping even with her horse. She was very glad to get home that night. She explained that horse was a favorite dish of the mountain lion, but she figured that the cat was afraid of her human scent. Grandma loved horses, and we used to take her to polo games at Hamburg Place, a horse farm near Lexington. None of us knew anything about polo, but she loved to see the horses work. Occasionally, she would go with us kids to the cowboy movies on Saturday afternoon. She wasn't at all interested in who got the girl. She just enjoyed watching the horses. When the movie Gone with the Wind came out, Grandma decided to take us kids to see it. She said that she knew that her old home in Wise County, Virginia wasn't as grand as the plantation homes we had seen in the movie, but she thought we could get some idea of what life had been like when she was growing up. She wanted us to see the clothes, particularly the ladies' dresses, and hear the manners of the speech that was used. Her father had owned a few slaves and was very much a Southern sympathizer. She told us that she understood that there was some bad language in the movie. Clark Gable said "damn" in the last scene of a 4-hour movie, and she was sorry about that, but she didn't know any other way for us to get a good idea of what life was like in those days in the South. We enjoyed the show and saw what Grandma wanted so much for us to see, but there was one problem for us children that I can remember very clearly to this day. I mentioned that the movie lasted 4 hours. In those days, a typical movie lasted about 1.5 hours. To let people have a little chance to stretch, They had an intermission at the 2-hour point. They turned off the projector, turned on the lights in the theater, and gave everyone 15 minutes to get up and walk around and find refreshments. Money was not at all plentiful in those days, and Grandma didn't want to buy junk food for us, but she knew the children would be hungry, so she fixed a box lunch for us in a shoebox. I don't remember the details of the contents of the box, but the main ingredient was fresh fried chicken that she had cooked just before we left the house to go get on the streetcar. When she lifted the top of the shoebox, a lovely odor of that fried chicken rapidly spread over several rows in front of us and behind us. We children noticed several people in front of us turning around to see where that delightful odor was coming from, and we were totally embarrassed. And there we were, near the middle of the theater with the lights on, and we thought everyone in the theater was looking at us. We kids were embarrassed, but it didn't bother Grandma. She knew that all those people were just wishing passionately that they could have some of that chicken too. Curtis Parker and our clinkers. When we first moved to Sturgis, Kentucky, there was an old colored man named Curtis Parker who lived and worked there. Curtis was a leading member of the colored community. We called Negroes colored in those days. Later, the socially acceptable term became black, and then fashion changed again, and now it is African American. Whatever the descriptive term, Curtis earned his living with a horse and small wagon, and he hauled trash for just about everybody in Sturgis. As was the case with many Negroes in those days, he had mastered the art of getting along fine with the white community. He was invariably polite, completely dependable, and ingratiated himself with all the households in town by carrying news to the ladies when he stopped by to pick up the trash. Some people might have called it gossip, but it really wasn't, because Curtis was careful not to carry news that could be hurtful. As a result, all the ladies looked forward to his visits as a cheerful and pleasant break in their day. You can get a fair idea of the wisdom and insight which made him a favorite of so many by a statement he made when we were having problems at the time our schools were first integrated. We had a lot of outside help and advice, including National Guard troops. Some of the ladies asked Curtis what he thought about all that when he was picking up their trash. He answered, "As some of these Negroes don't hush up, some of us N-words gonna get killed." Incidentally, if white people use the term N-word, it was an insult, but if the Negroes commonly use the term to one another, social conventions are not always logical. I will back up now and tell about our clinkers. The first house we had in Sturgis was on Talbot Street. It was a fairly large house with a full basement and was heated by a coal-fire hot water system with a device called a stoker to feed the crushed coal into the firebox as it was needed. That heating system, probably due to aging, really tried our patience. The fire would go out, always in the middle of the cold night, and then the stoker would fill the furnace with coal. I had to get the coal out of the furnace, build a new fire, and go to bed, hopefully. This often seemed to happen when I came in from the middle of the night after a house call. It probably just seemed that way when it happened at those really bad times. It's a lot like delivering babies. We used to think that most of them came in the nighttime, but careful records show that it's about an even split between daytime and nighttime. The heating system didn't function well and keep the old house warm because the pipes for the hot water were old. Sturgis water was terrible, and that made the radiators warm rather than hot. We used to put the children to bed in their snowsuits so they would stay warm all night. During the daytime, we would have fires and 2 grates to help out the furnace, but those fires always went out at night. And that wasn't all. We really couldn't get good quality coal, so when the furnace did burn, it produced an inordinate amount of waste material called clinkers. These resemble reddish-brown chunks of iron ore and had to be lifted out of the furnace with long tongs and disposed of in some fashion. The furnace and stoker were in a small basement room separate from the rest of the basement, and there was an outside door to the furnace room which opened into a stairwell in the yard behind the house. I would take the clinkers out, put them in buckets, and set the buckets wherever I could. One winter, I wound up in the heating season with all the floor space in the furnace room covered with buckets, and then clinkers piled on top of the buckets. In addition, I had the entire stairwell filled with buckets and clinkers piled on top. Curtis was in the office one day, and I asked him if he would come to our house at his convenience and haul my winter's clinkers away. He agreed and showed up at the house with his horse and wagon one Saturday morning. I was busy as usual in those days, but when I happened to be at home that day, I noticed Curtis there off and on all day. Late in the afternoon, he came to me and told me that he was finished. I asked him what I owed him, and I paid him. And then he said to me, "Doctor, you asked me to haul your clinkers. I said I would, and I've done hauled them all away. There's just one more thing I want to say. Don't ever ask me to haul your clinkers again." I was able to honor that request because we moved into the new house on Dyer Hill in October, and I never had to fire that furnace again. The house wasn't near finished, but we moved into the basement because I just couldn't face coming home in the middle of the night to deal with that furnace one more time. Curtis is in glory now, but I enjoyed him, and I'm sure I'm grateful that he hauled my clinkers one time. Don't worry about nothing. When our children got big enough that we wanted to start showing them the world outside of Sturgis, the first long trips we made were to Dulac, Louisiana, to visit with Cajun friends we had met through my old friend from Lexington, David Graves. The first trip, we stayed in the home of Irving and Stella Blanchard. The second trip, we stayed with the James Trosclair family. The third trip was with our trailer, and we put the trailer in the yard of Mr. and Mrs. Willis Domingue. They were wonderful trips, and we remember the hospitality of those good Cajun people with grateful hearts. The seafood was wonderful, the people were warm and gracious, and all we can say is that they were truly memorable experiences. This story comes from our second trip, when we stayed with the Trosclairs. The Trosclair family, 4 brothers, owned a shrimp buying plant. They would buy shrimp from the boats when they returned home, remove the heads and pack the tails, and wholesale them to buyers from the large cities in southern Louisiana. They seemed to do very well at this, and also supplied employment to many of the women in the neighborhood. They had what they called their camp, which was an old work barge, which had housed workmen on large marine construction projects. The hull had rusted out so badly that constant pumping was required to keep the barge afloat, and the owner gave it to the Trosclairs, provided that they got it out of his way. They had towed it down the bayou to the bay, near the open ocean, and grounded it in shallow water. It had a large room for a lounge and a dining room, a well-furnished kitchen, and 30 or 40 small bedrooms. There was a narrow deck that surrounded the large cabin area. It made a wonderful place for them to go when they wanted to hunt or fish. We all spent a weekend out on the camp barge, David and Mary Beth and their children, our family, and a couple of the Trosclair families. We spent that weekend catching, cooking, and eating seafood. I remember going out in a small boat with James Trosclair with the long tongs to gather oysters. When we got back to put our oysters up on the deck of the camp, James's wife started opening and eating those fresh, raw oysters right there on the deck. Her comment, after eating several, was, "I like to eat 'em with the mud running off my elbows." The Trosclairs were an interesting couple. He was an excellent businessman and the acknowledged leader of the 4 brothers, but was unable to read and write. Mrs. Trosclair did all his bookkeeping, ordering, and paying of accounts. Incidentally, she was an excellent housekeeper, mother, and cook, too. Quite a lady. There was one of the 4 brothers who never seemed to do any work. What he seemed to do was to occupy all his time staying rather drunk. A frightening aspect was that he was home for his time off from the Mississippi River towboat, of which he was the captain. One of the other brothers explained that brother had very serious heart disease and could die at any moment. Therefore, they allowed him to do anything he wanted to do. He asked us to please excuse our brother. The camp was wired for electric lights, and Mr. Trosclair took a large motor generator out with us. It was a very large unit. We laboriously moved it from the boat to the deck, plugged it into the camp electrical system, and proceeded to try to start the gasoline engine. Although it was large, it still was started by pulling a rope to spin over the engine. We tried hard, doing everything intelligent we could figure out, but we couldn't start that engine. One at a time, we literally wore ourselves out pulling that rope, all the while making all conceivable adjustments to the throttle and the choke. Fairly often, Brother would stumble down the deck to our group and try to render assistance to us. Mr. Trosclair and the other brother with us would gently tell him that we would take care of it, and he would stumble down the deck. Finally, the two Trosclairs, David and I, were worn out and gave up. We were sitting there trying to think of something else we could do when Brother stumbled up again, and we were all too tired to fend him off. He bent over the engine, literally slapped at the throttle and the choke, yanked the rope, and the engine roared to life. We sat there in weary amazement as Brother stumbled off, saying loudly, "Don't worry about nothing." Our Florida honeymoon. Betty and I were married in December of 1954. It was during the Christmas break of my junior year at medical school. My last class was over at noon on Saturday the 20th. We had a rehearsal and dinner that night. David Graves gave me a bachelor party afterwards, and our wedding was on Sunday afternoon, December 21st. All this was to stretch the break from school for a really nice honeymoon, and then to give us time to move our things into the apartment we had rented in Louisville. Being young and very much in love does strange things to you. While I was away in the Air Corps during the war, I was so bad as a letter writer that every so often my father would write to say, "Son, please write your mother before she goes crazy, and I do too." Soon after we were engaged, I headed back to Louisville for another semester in medical school. I went to Lexington every weekend, but because we were so terribly separated, I wrote a letter every day during the week. Fortunately, first-class postage was a nickel in those days, or we would never have saved enough money to get married. At this point in time, I don't have the faintest idea what I could have had to say in all those letters. Probably they were somewhat repetitious, but Betty was gracious and never complained. She got an early start at spoiling me, and she has kept it up for 40 years now. I still like it. I remember that day very well. It drizzled rain all day long, but stopped just long enough for Betty to get into the church without getting wet. Then it stopped again, long enough for us to get from the church, First Methodist in Lexington, to the Alpha Delta Pi house, where we had the reception. By the time we left the reception, she was no longer wearing that beautiful long dress, and so we didn't care whether it rained or not. Another thing I remember about that day was I couldn't talk Grandma Lips into coming to the wedding. I knew that Grandma was reluctant to marry and leave her parents' home, but finally married because she couldn't stand to think of Jonas Lips marrying someone else. She put it off as long as she could, but she finally did marry. Life must have been really difficult after she married and went in a buggy from Wise County, Virginia, across the mountains to Kentucky, separated from her family and probably in very modest circumstances. Whatever the reason, she thought a wedding was about the saddest thing she could think of. She thought that young people in love, married with stars in their eyes, and then, instead of bliss, settled down to the serious business of living day by day. As a very small child, I can remember Mother working all day in the basement, doing our family washing on a washboard. And when I think about that, I can see something of what Grandma was talking about. Anyway, I left the house to go to the church a few minutes early and went by Grandma's house, certain I could talk her into getting into the car with me and going to the wedding. I was wrong. She said, "Jerry, I never saw one of my girls married, even when they were married, right here in this house, and I'm not going to start now." I enjoyed a special relationship with Grandma, having had lunch at her house every day the 4 years I was in college in Lexington. We both really enjoyed those lunchtimes, and she told me a lot of the stories about the old days in Virginia. I kept begging her so long that I was almost late to my own wedding, but I had to leave Grandma sitting in her rocker in the living room. The next thing I remember is watching Betty walk down the aisle of the church. If you will take a look at her wedding portrait, you will believe that I am telling the truth when I say that she was the most beautiful girl I had ever seen, much less known. I can't describe how I felt as I watched her walk toward me, even though I feel it all over again as I write, almost as if it happened just a few minutes ago. I think that I wanted to run to meet her, but I just stood still and rejoiced. I remember the wedding very clearly, but I don't remember details of the rest of the day too well. After we left the reception and got away from our friends who chased us, we left in Daddy's car with a Christmas tree that we had cut with Betty's family, a lot of holly, we cut off Grandma Lips's holly trees, and a lot of fishing tackle in the trunk. I don't recall using the fishing tackle. We borrowed Daddy's car because my car was a 1941 Mercury with a lot of miles on it, and we headed for Florida. Our first stop was in Cincinnati. We checked into the presidential suite at the Terrace Plaza Hotel, and it was fabulous. It was huge, with a huge sitting room, a kitchen, and a bedroom, and the entire outside wall was glass. We paid the terrible price of $25 for that suite. The next day, we headed south again, right through Lexington and on down US 25 for Florida. That was before interstates were even thought of. We had to spend the night on the road, I think in northern Florida, and went on to Clearwater Beach the next day. Daddy's cousin, Jack, Aunt Bertie's son, was in real estate in Tampa, Florida. He'd gotten us an efficiency apartment on Clearwater Beach. It was in a Sunset Motel, which was also super nice. Cars were parked on the ground floor with the apartments on the floor above, looking out on the Gulf just about 100 feet away. We had one of the cheaper ones, and it cost $75 a week. It was a one-room efficiency with a nice bath and tiny kitchen behind folding doors. We hadn't really gotten our things in and settled when the ladies who managed the place came to see us. Somehow, they found out that we were newlyweds, and they insisted that we move into their best apartment for the same price. That one had a big living room with the kitchen behind the folding doors, a beautiful separate bedroom, and a large bath with a separate outside door for coming in from the beach. The regular price for that apartment was $125 a week. It really looked like something out of a movie, and we were in seventh heaven. We got in late in the afternoon, so we ate supper in the restaurant and then went up to a grocery and stocked up, including a turkey about the size of a big hen. After that, Betty fixed all our meals in the apartment, including biscuits. She had never made biscuits before, but they were wonderful, and I was a real judge of biscuits. Somewhere along the way, Betty asked me if Mother made biscuits every day. She didn't ask me how long it had been since she made biscuits every day, so I said yes. It took her about a year to remember to ask me the how long part, but by that time she liked them too. Betty cooked that little turkey for our first Christmas dinner and invited the ladies who managed the apartment to be our guests. It was a lovely dinner, and the ladies complimented her and congratulated me. That week on the beach was like a dream. The beach was so beautiful, the apartment was so lovely, and we were so happy we could hardly stand it. Fortunately, we didn't know any better. We were lying out on the sand, taking swims and walking down the beach. We thought that was the thing to do in Florida. We were completely ignorant of the fact that Central Florida and South Florida were two different things. All the local people gave us strange looks as we walked past as they walked past us sunbathing, and they were all wrapped up in great big winter coats. Our week came to an end, and we headed Daddy's Studebaker up the road for home. We got home with $75 left from the $350 we had when we had left for our trip. That made us able to get settled in our apartment in Louisville. I really expected to get home and start married life flat broke, but I thought that having such a wonderful honeymoon to remember all the rest of our lives together would be well worth it. We had our minds made up to just get married once. We did it right, and we have never regretted it. We have had a wonderful marriage. It started wonderful, and it has kept on being wonderful. God has been so good to us. Taste out. As an adult, I only had contact with one friend who dated back to my childhood. That was David Graves. He was a very large man who liked everything in wholesale amounts at wholesale prices. This story happened after the corner grocery was replaced by the supermarket, but before they started staying open on Sunday. I'm not sure exactly when it happened, but it should have been in the late 1950s. David made a habit of going to the A&P or Kroger's, usually the A&P, about an hour before closing time on Saturday night. He and Mary Beth, his wife, would buy their groceries for the week, and then Dave would check the fresh fruit section. He would look for something they still had a fairly large amount of that wouldn't keep well until Monday. Then he would talk to the produce manager and offer about half price for the fruit, and would often get his price and a large amount of fruit. Then he and Mary Beth would have to spend the weekend canning or freezing, Dave's bargain. I never heard of Mary Beth complaining about this, which proves that she was the soul of patience. On one occasion, Dave bought so many grapes that they just couldn't use them up. This was a great problem because David hated to waste anything, even more than he loved to get a bargain. Late on Sunday afternoon, after they had made all the juice and jelly they had jars for, they still had about a bushel of nice Concord grapes. Finally, he had an inspiration. He remembered a colored lady who was reputed to know how to make wine. Dave decided that he would save the grapes as wine, learn something, and later enjoy the wine too. Dave found the lady at home, explained that he wanted to turn a bushel of grapes into wine, and asked her to give him instructions. She told him that it was very simple. All he had to do was to mash the grapes in a suitable stone jar, add a certain amount of sugar, cover the open top of the jar with a piece of cheesecloth, and leave it undisturbed for a week, and then come back for further instructions. Dave did that, and at the end of the first week, she instructed him to uncover the jar, skim it, sweeten it to taste, and cover it up again. This same story was repeated week after week. Each time he went back, all she would say was to uncover the jar, skim it, sweeten it to taste, and cover it up again. After a few weeks, Dave began to ask her when he was supposed to take it up and bottle his wine. The only answer he could get was, uncover it, skim it, sweeten it to taste, and cover it up again. After a few more weeks, Dave finally lost patience and said, "Auntie, I'm tired of the same answer every week and week after week. How do I know when to take it up and bottle it?" Her answer then was to say, "I'm sorry, Mr. Dave, but I can't tell you that because I most generally taste out." Grubber. When I was in high school, I had a friend we called Grubber. We weren't best friends, but we enjoyed each other. I don't have the faintest idea why we called him Grubber. He was a little below average height, was a little overweight, and all in all wasn't a very impressive individual. Really pleasant and nice, but not impressive. I only went to his neighborhood one time, and then didn't get to see his house. He lived north of East 3rd Street, not a good section of town at all. I suspect that he didn't take me to his house because he probably was a little ashamed of his house, knowing that we lived on Bell Court, an old neighborhood, not fancy at all, but nice. Anyhow, after that we never visited each other's home areas, but we still enjoyed each other at school. After a while, we moved to the house President Roosevelt's Federal Housing Authority made Tessie and Daddy Garnett able to build on Kingsway Drive, even further out in the east end of town, and I sort of lost track of Grubber. I would hear about him once in a while, and that was about all. Also, not too long after, World War II began to brew. Grubber must have been a little older than me because he went into the Army before I did, and I would immediately after my 18th birthday, 8 days to be specific. Everyone was totally concerned about the war in those days, and we had lots of news drifting back about the people who were in service. Somehow, we learned that Grubber wound up in the 8th Air Force in England, and that he was a tail turret gunner on a B-24 crew. After I went into the Air Corps, I didn't hear any more about Grubber. I quickly found out that the Air Corps cadet program was the Air Corps' way of recruiting people for other types of work. After basic training at Keesler Field in Mississippi, we went to an aptitude program which determined that depth perception prevented me from being a pilot, and I wound up in radio mechanics school. When I could, I opted out of that into a gunnery program and wound up in the tail turret of a B-24 crew, just like Grubber. I had a lot of fun, but the war in Europe finished up before our crew got orders to take a plane to England. Then we went to the West Coast to wait for a boat trip to the Pacific Theater, and that war wound up just before we got to a boat. I stayed on the West Coast for a while, and then got discharged and came home. After I got home and got in contact with old friends and acquaintances, I heard how the war treated Grubber. His crew was bombing deep into Germany. After they got beyond the range of our fighter aircraft, there was a flak in German fighters and aircraft all the way out, and all the way back until they were very close to the English Channel, and our fighters could cover them. On one of those missions, the German fighters were very active, and Grubber's tail turret took a hit, but Grubber kept on firing. The tail turret was far enough away from the waist window, where the waist gunner worked, that no one knew what was going on back there unless the gunner told them on the intercom or the turret stopped firing. What we heard was that Grubber's turret continued to fire until they had the channel in sight, and our fighter cover drove the ME-109s away. No one knew that there was any problem until Grubber failed to come back out of the turret to take a seat with his back against the command deck bulkhead for the landing. After they were on the ground, the other gunners went to check and found Grubber dead in his turret, and the bottom of the turret full of blood. A less than average height, slightly overweight guy who didn't seem really impressive was hit far out in Germany and said nothing while he continued to protect the rear of his aircraft. He managed to stay alive and firing until they were back under our air cover, and then, without a word, he quietly slipped away. Grubber wasn't very impressive in life, but I know that wherever God keeps the truly super soldiers in heaven, in that super wonderful place is where I'll find Grubber when God takes me to heaven. I won't write a place beside him, but it will be a rich blessing to see him there. Soldiers are tough, aren't they? I remember going into the Army in 1944 and the things that led up going in. The war had been in progress for 2 years, and almost everyone in the country was at a high level of patriotism. I enlisted in the Army Air Corps cadet program when I was 17, but I couldn't actually enter service until I was 18. The cadet program had 3 tracks, one for pilots, one for navigators, and one for bombardiers. I hadn't the slightest doubt that I would be in the pilot track and that I would wind up flying a P-38. That airplane had a central pod on the wing for the pilot and the guns, 2 engines outboard, one on either side, with twin booms extending back from the engines to the tail section, which had a long horizontal stabilizer elevator, and 2 small vertical stabilizer rudders behind the twin booms. I thought that was the most beautiful airplane ever built, and I didn't have any doubt that I would have one before long. I found out soon the cadet program of the Air Corps was the Air Corps' way of recruiting gunners, but that wasn't too bad. I did get to be a member of an air crew and put in a lot of time in the B-24 bomber in the tail turret. It was somewhat of a come-down from the beautiful P-38 to the dowdy B-24, but when I found out how capable and dependable the B-24 was, I stopped grieving about the P-38. The B-24 was a huge bomb bay. We could carry twice the load of a B-17, with whatever else needed to be attached to that bomb bay to make it fly. It was built to do a job, and it did that job very, very well. I saw a picture once of a B-24, which had the fuselage above the waist windows blown away by a flak, and that airplane continued to fly and brought its crew home. Anyway, I turned 18 on the 11th of January and reported in at Fort Thomas, Kentucky on the 17th. Fort Thomas was a very old station and much too small for the large number of 18-year-olds going through on their way to basic training. The result was that I spent my first night in service sleeping on one of the cots that covered the floor of a large gymnasium. I don't know how many were there, but it was a bunch, at least 100, and probably more. All I remember was thinking that it was a huge room. What I really remember is the sounds in the room as we were all trying to go to sleep. I was excited, and all I could see was my P-38. There were a good many of those young men, though, who weren't really excited and happy. It took me a while to get to sleep, and I recall that lying there in the dark, first from one direction and then from another, I could hear someone snub. Nobody actually broke down enough to cry, at least not out loud. But there were young men scattered around that huge room who were suddenly weeping when they realized that home was in one direction, but they were going in another direction, and probably for a long time. I'm sure that all of those young men, with very few exceptions, followed orders and were good soldiers until they got home with their families or with the Lord. But that night wasn't easy. When we think about the young men and women serving our country in the military today, we need to remember that they are a long way from home. Beautiful babies. In the course of 48 years of hospital medical practice, I delivered about 2,500 babies. I don't know exactly how many there were. My father urged me to keep a separate record of all my deliveries. I thought I was too busy for that, and for a long time I have been very sorry for that very inadequate reason for that decision. This story is about 2 of those babies, because they were distinctly different from all the others. The first one was supposed to be an abortion. The mother's husband was overseas in the military and had been there so long that this baby couldn't possibly be his progeny. The mother decided that the easy way out of her dilemma was abortion and proceeded to go across the river to have it done. The usual thing in these cases, and it was in this one, was to visit the abortionist who inserted an instrument into the uterus, brutalizing the contents of the uterus, and the mother then went home. The procedure was completely unsterile, so the bleeding was always accompanied by infection and fever. When the bleeding and fever was firmly established, then the mother would go to a physician or hospital. That happened in this case. The mother came to our emergency room, and I was the lucky guy on call, so I had to deal with this mess. You can't adequately deal with the infection, which is life-threatening, until you empty the uterus, so I took her to the delivery room. I couldn't find any signs of life in the baby, so I proceeded to empty the uterus. I had delivered the baby breech, and with the lower extremities and buttocks out, I was waiting for the next series of contractions to deliver the rest of the body. As I sat waiting, one of those terribly bruised legs kicked. That changed a leisurely procedure into one of extreme, very careful activity. We delivered a little boy, terribly bruised from head to toe, who weighed 2 pounds and 3 ounces. He really looked more like a drowned puppy than a little boy, with skin so thin that you could see the blood vessels between the skin and the muscle. The eyes were closed, just like a puppy, and didn't open for more than 2 weeks. Obviously, our 25-bed hospital didn't have a pediatric intensive care unit. What we did have, and I'm convinced that that was infinitely more important than fancy equipment, was ladies who would take turns sitting by the bassinet looking at the baby every moment of the 24 hours. The nurse with the baby never took her eyes off the baby. If there was a bubble of mucus in his nose or mouth, it was gently suctioned out. Every need was cared for immediately. The little boy lost down to 1 pound, 13 ounces, in spite of everything we could do. Then, our nursing supervisor, a registered nurse near retirement age, after spending a working lifetime in a country town, suggested that we add applesauce. We did that, mixing it with formula and a brake feeder, a small glass tube with a nipple on one end and a squeeze bulb on the other, and he took off like a rocket. We had him with us for 4.5 months and sent him home weighing 4.5 pounds. We had a problem with all our ladies wanting to resign and go home with him. The mother's husband was called home from overseas due to medical problems in his family. Then we saw a remarkable thing happen. In those days, the hospital did not furnish shirts and diapers. The family had to send someone each day to pick up the dirty things and leave the clean things. When he got home, that man came in and looked at the baby through the nursery window. I don't know why. Probably because the tiny boy was so pitiful looking about a week after he was delivered, but that man seemed to immediately love the baby. The mother seemed to resent the baby and didn't come to visit the baby more than once or twice in the 4.5 months he was in our care. The husband, not technically related to the baby, would come each day and stand at the nursery window and look at the baby for 20 or 30 minutes. When the baby grew enough to need shirts and diapers, he came every day with clean things, picked up the soiled things, and looked at the baby for a long time. I wasn't in the hospital when the family could be allowed to touch and hold the baby, and I'm really sorry I didn't get to see him hold the baby for the first time. A lot of things about this case are hard to explain, but I know that the marriage survived and did not end in divorce, and that boy was spoiled within an inch of his life. The other baby I'm telling about, in a different way, was just as remarkable as the tiny premature who was supposed to be an abortion. The mother of this baby was a mousy, quiet little girl, not ugly, but definitely plain, with the added problem of severe acne. Definitely not the cheerleader or queen of the ball type, and I think that explains the terrible thing that happened to her. She went out on a date, and when the boy arrived there was another boy in the car. Instead of running back into the house, she got in the car and was shortly gang raped by the two boys. Why she didn't tell her parents and immediately call the police, I don't know. But she didn't tell anyone until she realized that she was pregnant. By that time, any halfway decent defense lawyer would have had no trouble defending the two boys, and they were never called to account for what they did to that girl. I'm sure that she realized that the community would not believe that she had been raped, and that she would be treated like small communities treat girls who got pregnant without a husband. Instead of choosing the easy way out like the other girl did, she chose to carry the baby to term, deliver the baby, and raise the baby. That decision required vastly more courage than I would have expected to find in a mousy little girl who had been horribly mistreated. But I know that she had that kind of courage. I delivered both of these babies and cared for them as they grew up in our town. What I'm about to tell you is almost scary, but it proves that God moves in our lives today. Those two babies, one who was supposed to be an abortion and one the result of rape that was never prosecuted, were the most beautiful children and later the handsomest young men of all the babies I ever delivered. Don't look, Ethel. I love to fly airplanes and can't remember when I didn't want to fly. Fortunately, or perhaps the reverse, I had a wonderful friend, Pete Wicks, who felt the same way I did. As a teenager, he acquired a terrible little plane called a Dart. That's a funny story in itself. It seems that Pete's father was hooked on horses, and somewhere along the way, Pete managed to own a beautiful horse that was too hard-headed to ride. An older man in town, whose name I can't remember, had the plane and wanted the horse. He and Pete agreed to an even trade if the man was pleased after giving the horse a test ride. The man got on the horse, Pete held his breath, and the horse high-stepped around the lot as gentle as a lamb. They made the trade, and Pete said that was the last time the man was able to get on the horse. Then Pete started the engine on the Dart and discovered that it was very sick. Pete said that his horse wouldn't ride and the man's plane wouldn't fly. Pete later got the plane functioning, sort of, and why he didn't get killed in it, no one knows. Pete and I managed to egg each other on until we had a Cessna 172. I learned to fly in that 172, and we used it for quite a while. My son John was learning in the same plane and soloed on his 16th birthday. He had a pilot's license before he had a driver's license. Before John completed his license, we had a chance to buy a Cessna 210, a big single-engine plane with a retractable landing gear. John had to finish his license in a tail dragger plane, much more difficult to land, that belonged to the local flying club. Later, Pete and I were able to move into a much newer Cessna 210 that had a turbocharged engine, built-in oxygen, and a nice set of radios. That was the plane involved in this story. My good friend Tommy Wallace, my good friend Robert Christian, and Bing Steelman, the local banker, and I went to Canada in that wonderful plane to fish for smallmouth bass in Lake of the Woods. Tommy and I fished in one boat with an Indian guide, and Robert and Bing fished in the other boat, also with an Indian guide. It was early summer, and we had a wonderful time. We would go out about 8 o'clock, fish for walleye pike until we had enough fish for lunch, and then start bass fishing. Our guides spoke excellent English to us, Ojibwe to each other, and were rather quiet individuals. We went out one morning, caught only one walleye, but decided to go bass fishing anyway. By lunchtime, Tommy and I had a nice string of bass and the one small walleye. We saw the other boat headed for a point to fix lunch and started that way. Robert and Bing hollered that they hadn't caught anything. We hollered not to worry, and about that time our stringer came loose from the boat, and our nice stringer of fish disappeared beneath the water. This was the cause of great sadness, because that meant our lunch would be Spam, not wonderful fresh fried fillets of bass. While Tommy and I were bemoaning this tragedy, the guide paddled around a little bit and then announced that he thought he could see light reflecting off the fish at the bottom of the lake, which was only about 15 feet deep. I pondered over this Spam problem, and then decided it was worth a try to dive and recover the fish. I also pondered the prospect of spending the rest of the day in damp clothes, noted that we were the only people on the lake, pulled off all of my clothes, hunkered on the bow of the boat until the guide got me in the right place, and rolled off in the direction of the string of fish. I got my hand on the stringer the first dive, and the day suddenly looked better to all concerned. I still had a problem, though. If I got dressed immediately, I would still spend the rest of the day in wet underwear and damp clothing. I looked around and saw a huge slab of rock lying on the angled bank with the sun shining directly on the rock. So I walked over to the rock and hunkered down again on the warm rock with the sun shining directly on me. In about 10 minutes, I was dry as a chip and got dressed again. While I was in the sun drying, Robert Christensen took a picture of me, which was widely circulated around Sturgis when we got back home. But that wasn't all. For the rest of the afternoon, every time our boats happened to be in sight of each other, Bing Steelman would holler, "Don't look, Ethel!" and all 4 Americans would convulse with laughter. Down in the States, there was a comedy recording of a guy who sounded like a hick describing the time he and his wife were exposed to a streaker, which was the in thing at the time. Young people would remove all their clothing and run through some public area too fast to be recognized and punished. The man on the record would describe where they were, and then when the streaker showed up, he would shout, "Don't look, Ethel!" We finally noticed that the Indian guides didn't laugh with us. When we would all convulse with laughter, the guides looked puzzled and were very quiet. We tried hard to explain to them about the record, which was so funny to us, and then bring them in on the matter of my sun drying, but it never did seem to amuse them. Talk about culture differences. Old Blue. I used to hunt quail, but at first I didn't really know much about quail hunting. I was fortunate enough at first to have a friend who did know how, and who had a first-rate bird dog. That friend was Lawrence Travis, who lived by Maple Sink, a small lake in Crittenden County. My father, Daddy Garnett, introduced me to Lawrence, and it was a very great favor indeed. Lawrence and his wife Louise lived on a farm by the lake, surrounded by other Travises. They kept cattle and raised a little corn, and Lawrence drove a truck on a route picking up milk cans from other small dairy farmers for a creamery. They were simple, very good country people, and we were very much the better for having them for our friends. Lawrence started me on bird hunting. There were quail in the vicinity, and he had permission to hunt the entire area, enjoyed hunting, and had one of the best bird dogs the world ever saw. I've tried and retried to remember the dog's name, and I can't, so I will call the dog Old Blue. That is because he looked more like a coon hound than a bird dog, and was dark purplish blue with lots of irregular white areas, what people call a blue tick hound. Lawrence said he was a dropper, a cross between an English pointer and an English setter. That is possible, but there was a hound in the woodwork somewhere. Appearances notwithstanding, he was just about the best bird dog I ever hunted behind. He had a wonderful nose, hunted close so you always knew exactly where he was, retrieved, never failed to back another dog. In short, a wonderful bird dog. He only had one fault. He was what Lawrence called timid. Once he pointed, he wouldn't move no matter what the birds did until his hunter came up for the flush and shot. That was really no problem, except for the time I'm going to tell you about. We had a farm close to Marion, 150 acres, but there were 7 coveys of quail on it. Lawrence and I agreed to meet there for a Wednesday afternoon hunt. We had been harvesting his birds for a long time, and I thought it would be courteous to harvest a few of mine. I drove up to the house, and there was Lawrence's car, but Louise was driving, and Lawrence was nowhere in sight. Louise got out, told me that Lawrence had turned his ankle, and so couldn't hunt, but had sent Old Blue so that I could go on and hunt. Now, that is a friend. I thanked Louise for her trouble, told her that I would bring the dog home at the end of the day, and Old Blue and I started out. What I didn't know, because I really didn't know how to hunt birds at this point, was that because we were having an extended spell of hot, dry weather, the birds would be restless and tend to run away from the dog after he pointed, if you didn't see the dog point and run to him as quickly as you could. Later, I had a really good dog named Jip who wouldn't tolerate that. He would back out very carefully, swing wide, and point the birds again from the backside. Not so Old Blue. When he pointed, regardless of what the birds did, he was locked up until you shot or told him to move on. Old Blue and I started finding birds right away. Old Blue would point. I would leisurely walk up to him, walk around in front of him to flush the birds, and no birds came up. I would speak to the dog, and we would go on. This happened 5 times in about an hour, and the last time, Old Blue, aware that he was working for an idiot who wasn't going to get the birds up, settled down with his belly on the ground, his nose pointing to where the last smell of birds was, and refused to move. It took me 15 minutes of petting and cajoling conversation to get Old Blue up and going again. Louise's stove wood. Louise and Lawrence Travis lived on a small farm on Maple Sink, a wonderful fishing lake in the south end of Crittenden County. They were friends of my father, Daddy Garnett, and were our good friends too, after we moved to western Kentucky. We and our children were always welcome there. I used their house as a hideaway the first year we were in West Kentucky. We lived in Marion that first year, and when I was so tired that I just had to have a little rest, I would go to Maple Sink and sleep on their living room couch. They didn't have a telephone then, and so someone had to have a very serious problem for it to be worth driving all the way down there to get me up and going. That year, I spent much more time asleep on the Travis's couch than I did really visiting with them. One time, when we were really visiting with them, Lawrence was out working and Louise was talking with us. She got to talking about the old days when they were first married. Like most young people just starting out in marriage, they had to work hard and still be very careful and cost-conscious. She told us that they came to the farm and started living in the house when it was much smaller than it is now. She told how she helped Lawrence with the work on the farm, mostly shelling corn for the hogs when Lawrence was working in the field from early morning to late in the evening. Then she told us about another young couple, also recently married, who lived close, and the wife was such a blessing to Louise. Then she told us that there was one thing about the couple that was the scandal of the neighborhood. The husband wouldn't cut and split wood for the wife's cook stove. Instead, he would bring in long poles, and she had to feed the long poles into the stove as the part in the stove burned off. She told us in great detail how everyone in the neighborhood felt sorry for the young lady whose husband wouldn't provide her with sawed and split wood for her cook stove, and she sometimes had poles sticking out her stove all the way across the room. All of a sudden, she got an odd look on her face and said, "You know, we were shelling a lot of corn for our hogs, and all I burned in my cook stove was corn cobs. If we hadn't had those hogs, I might have had to feed poles into my cook stove." We all had a real good laugh after that. John and the Trainmen. Our firstborn son, John, was born while we were in Lexington, and I was interning at Good Samaritan Hospital. That was a blessing because we had 2 grandmothers plus some great aunts to help us properly care for our new baby. We moved to Marion, Kentucky for his second year and discovered that the two of us, mostly Betty, could keep the child alive and well. While he was still 2 years old, we moved to Sturgis. That's a funny story in itself. We lived in Marion 1 year and were certain that the tensions we observed between the various communities in the county would prevent a consolidated school system for a long time, possibly forever. So we decided to move to Sturgis in Union County, where they already had a consolidated system. About 18 months after we moved, the school system in Marion and Crittenden County was consolidated. So much for our forecasting ability. Our first home in Sturgis was a frame house on Talbot Street that we rented from Dr. Carr's wife. Dr. Carr helped us with our decision to move. Across the street was a house with a wide side yard and railroad tracks behind the lot. Trains passed by once or twice a day, and Betty often took John by the hand to walk across the street and wave at the trainmen as the train passed by. The trainmen always smiled and waved back at the pretty young lady and her handsome child. Betty assumed that John would enjoy the excitement of the train passing by and waving at the trainmen. However, she soon noticed that he didn't seem anxious to go over there and would pull back a little when the noisy train began to get close to them. Finally, she asked him if he liked going to see the train. He answered, "No." She asked him why he didn't like going to see the train, and he answered, "Might bite me." She tried hard to explain that the train, although very large and noisy, could not leave the iron tracks, and so couldn't possibly hurt him, but still all he would say was, "Might bite me." That stopped the trips to see the train. It was characteristic of John to not say anything about how he felt until he was asked a direct question. Come to think of it, he may not have changed much at all in those years that have gone by since we lived on Talbot Street. Referring patients. My first office was in Marion, Kentucky. Betty and I took a tour of West Kentucky after I finished my internship at the Good Samaritan Hospital in Lexington, Kentucky, to choose a community in which to live, work, and raise our children. We looked only in small towns because that was the type of social situation we wanted as the place to raise our children. We picked out Marion, Kentucky, after visiting all over the western third of the state. Crittenden County is beautiful, with lots of woods, had a lot of small farmers, and had a small hospital where I could care for my seriously ill patients. Another plus was a couple, O.M. and Iris Shelby, who were old friends of my father, Daddy Garnett. Mr. Shelby was the retired country farm agent, and Daddy Garnett had enjoyed both of them for a long time because they were really fine people. They helped us locate a house and office space and introduced us to the community. Finally, when I told them I would prefer an older lady to help me in the office, Mrs. Shelby volunteered for that job. We set up that first office in the old Crittenden Hotel, which was a huge brick building on Carlisle Street, east of the courthouse square. I rented my office space on the ground floor from Mrs. Dadd, who owned the old hotel, which really wasn't very functional anymore. Mrs. Dadd's husband was a veterinarian, trained at McGill University in Toronto, Canada. At that time, he was the only trained vet in the area and was very proud of his credentials. Dr. Dadd was a very pleasant old gentleman, and he and I got along fine, and were close enough to be able to kid each other a lot. One day it occurred to me to ask Dr. Dadd if we could help one another when we had a particularly confusing case by referring patients to one another, thereby keeping the business at home. Dr. Dadd gave the idea several moments of careful consideration and then responded negatively. He quickly explained, saying, "My patients probably wouldn't complain at all, but your patients would probably not like having to wear that halter." Incidentally, Dr. Dadd gave us our registered standard-bred horses, Fancy and Judy. He left them to us in his will. Salmon P. Chase, an interesting character from the McKenney side. Quite a few family members have been given the name Chase, but not Salmon, because of this ancestor. He resigned from the Senate in 1861 to become President Lincoln's Secretary of the Treasury as the Civil War began. The war created the need to raise money, and with customs revenue from the southern cotton trade cut off, Chase had to implement internal taxes. The Bureau of Internal Revenue was created in 1862. In order to further finance the war, the Bureau of Engraving and Printing was established in 1862 to print the government's first currency, known as greenback because of their color. Chase disapproved in principle of the legal tender notes because there was no requirement for specie backing. They could be printed in unlimited quantities and were inflationary. He recognized their necessity in a time of emergency, but later, as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, he declared the notes unconstitutional. During this time, Chase also created the national banking system still in use today. He suggested the idea, worked out the important principles, and lobbied Congress to accept the idea. This secured an immediate market for government bonds and provided a permanent uniform national currency. After putting the nation's finances in a more favorable condition, Lincoln appointed him Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and he presided over the court during the difficult period of Reconstruction. The motto, "In God We Trust," was added to coinage during Chase's time as Secretary of the Treasury. Persons throughout the country wanted to recognize God on United States coins. During the war, the danger of the Republic being shattered forever was frighteningly real. People wondered what future historians would see in the shattered remains of their past. Would they not think we were a godless nation who had no God worthy of trust and praise, so that the coins reflected our own pride? Secretary Chase instructed James Pollock, director of the Mint at Philadelphia, to prepare a motto and a letter dated November 20th, 1861, which read, "Dear Sir, no nation can be strong except in the strength of God, or safe except in His defense. The trust of our people in God should be declared on our national coins. You will cause a device to be prepared without unnecessary delay, with a motto expressing in the fewest and tersest words possible this national recognition." And then, after much work at the Mint and an act of Congress allowing the change, on December 9th, 1863, Secretary Chase stated, "I approve your mottos, only suggesting that on that with the Washington observes, the motto should begin with the word 'our,' so as to read 'our God and our country,' and on that with the shield, it should be changed so as to read 'In God we trust.'" Chase associated himself with the anti-slavery movement throughout his adult life and became known as the Attorney General of Fugitive Slaves, attracting particular attention in the 1847 Van Zandt case before the Supreme Court. In this and other similar cases, the judgment always went against him, but he continued to pursue an end to slavery through the courts. His efforts to bring pressure on political parties to end slavery resulted in being influential in leadership of the Free Soilers, followed by a coalition with Democrats, then an election season as an independent Democrat, and finally helping to draft the Republican Party. At that time, an uncompromising anti-slavery record was essential to the Republican Party platform. And to conclude, a family story to illustrate that while we may each have done good things, we are each imperfect, all in need of a Savior, and throughout our lives in need of the freedom that comes with repentance. As a young man, Salmon had to leave Virginia and escape to Ohio. While in Virginia to visit a young lady he was interested in, he had acted rashly. There was another suitor there when Salmon arrived. Salmon was so angry that he cut off the mane and tail of his competitor's horse, a felony offense at the time. How Daddy Garnet Lost the Sight in His Right Eye. When he was a young child, my father, Daddy Garnet, and his cousin Dave were playing around, and cousin Dave accidentally shot Garnet in the right side of the head. The bullet lodged there and stayed for the rest of his life, and he was blinded in the right eye. It didn't stop him much. He had excellent eye-hand coordination and pitched baseball on the college level, even being asked to join the Cincinnati Reds as a pitcher. He declined the offer as he had a living to make, and Major League Baseball paid very little in those days. World War I came along, and Daddy Garnet wanted to be in the infantry, so he memorized the eye chart and got in. He didn't get caught until the first day on the rifle range. Sighting with the left eye and shooting with the gun on the wrong side of the body for reloading wasn't allowed. So he went to France as a field medic instead. How Daddy Garnet Found Spooks. As an agricultural extension agent traveling all over West Kentucky, my father, Daddy Garnet, fell in love with the beauty of the area. He had a bamboo fly fishing rod with him always, and enjoyed the beauty of many a farm stream over the years. He and my mother, Tessie, kept the home on 348 Kingsway in Lexington, but semi-retired to a farm in Crittenden County. There he walked the fields with a hoe for thistling, always in hand, and drove an old truck we called Rackety Boom. One day while walking the farm, a hairless ghost of a dog, naked from mange, appeared at the edge of the woods. Daddy Garnet took him home and tenderly brought the most beautiful, luxurious English collie back to life. He named him Spooks for the fright he gave him when he first saw him, and he was the love of our lives for many happy years. Equally happy roaming the farm or in the big two-story in Lexington, Spooks would always let us pet and hug and bury our faces in his thick coat when we were tired or sad or happy, just as any good dog would. I hope you've enjoyed listening to See You at the House. It's been a blessing to me to revisit these stories that have lined the bookshelf of my mind all my life. I'm thankful for this chance to preserve them in this audiobook, or future generations of our family, and maybe even many others, can enjoy them and learn from them too. And now, to conclude this audiobook, I have the joy of introducing Poppy's daughter, my mother, Mary Ford McKenney Faulhaber. She was one of the people who knew and loved Poppy best, so it's only fitting that we close with her remembrances of him.
I'm so excited that Amy decided to create this audiobook, and I hope you loved getting to know my daddy, whom we call Poppy, in these stories. Throughout my life, Daddy called me baby or sweet patootie, as likely as Mary. I'd like to hear that again. He let me go everywhere with him. When I was little, I especially loved going to the hardware store to pick out tools and parts, and I still do. And on hospital rounds where I visited each patient with him. They all called me Little Doc. When I was young, even though I had a severe overbite, Daddy thought I was beautiful already and didn't even want to get it corrected. I'm so glad Mama won out on that point. He was one of the brightest people I ever met, while also down to earth. Daddy was fascinated with the world and everything in it. He was compassionate and kind, adventurous, and a prodigious eater. He was sweetly hilarious with an infectious laugh. He was hopelessly sentimental and a passionate lover of God's Word and of God Himself. Oh, but not always. Until I turned 13, Daddy always dutifully attended church with us, but it didn't seem to have much power in his daily life. Then suddenly, and I wish I knew why or how, Daddy became enthralled with God. Duty became delight. One first evidence we immediately saw of this at home was that Daddy stopped cussing. Cussing wasn't something he did when he was frustrated or angry. It was just his native language, and it peppered every conversation. He'd picked it up during his time in the service and carried it with him the rest of his life, until, for whatever reason, his relationship with God became real, sweet, and all-consuming to him. The greatest evidence of this all-consuming fire for the Lord was the harmony of the Gospels he spent 14 years creating. A harmony is a work that combines the 4 Gospels of the Bible into a single account, offering side-by-side comparison. I don't know how many copies of the Bible he bought in those 14 years, so he could literally cut and paste the passages into his 4-columned harmony. It covered our dining room table many a night. It's a heritage and heirloom of our family we will treasure for generations. Daddy was certain of God's goodness and love in times of crushing loss, and there were many. Daddy was a dreamer, undermining any business sense. His adventurous nature saw him follow his Uncle Lucius Smith's missionary doctor footsteps. Once he retired, rather than pursuing a life of leisure and pleasure, Daddy served faithfully as a missionary doctor, 6 months out of the year, every year, in Haiti. He even served in Sudan, flying under the radar into the civil war-torn nation. And in both Haiti and Sudan, Daddy and Mama served with great courage and were often in grave personal danger. Daddy loved being a pilot, but when you're the only doctor in town, that can be problematic. During that season, before other doctors came to our community, when Daddy would want to go flying, he conscientiously flew over the hospital every 15 minutes to see if he was needed. They had a system to alert him, which was a bed sheet spread out on the roof. He was a lover of pretty things in his woods and taught me about each bird, tree, and wildflower. I wish I could remember half of the ones he taught me on those walks through our woods. He loved the beauty of nature and greatly enjoyed the times he was able to elk hunt in the Rockies. The antlers of the trophies he bagged there grace several homes of our loved ones today. Daddy was so intelligent, always learning, and generously sharing what he knew. He was a gifted teacher in all subjects. Well, except for the practical ones that he assumed you would already know. An example of this was the day Daddy suddenly tried to teach me to drive a stick shift. We were on our way back from a hard day's work at the farm. So hot and tired and sweaty. And when we got to Sturgis, he pulled his old pickup truck over, got out, and said, "You drive us home." Well, I had never driven a stick shift before, and he didn't give me any instructions. He just assumed I was a smart girl and would figure it out. That old Ford pickup leapt and bucked and leapt and bucked until in exasperation he told me to scoot back over. And my first and last driving lesson with Daddy was over. Daddy was a sentimental romantic and celebrated his wedding anniversary every month by bringing Mama a red rose on the 21st of every month, and then a dozen each December. He did this no matter what. 2 weeks after my youngest daughter, Jenny, was born, Daddy had quintuple bypass surgery. Right before they took him back, he pulled out his wallet and gave me plenty of cash and told me that tomorrow was the 21st and to make sure that I took care of getting Mama a rose. So, of course, I did. Mama was so very touched and took her rose home with her as we waited for Daddy to recover. A strange shared experience by many heart surgery patients is that when they wake up from surgery, they are confused about what day it is. In their minds, they lose a day. Well, when Daddy woke up from surgery on the 22nd, he was certain it was the 21st of the month. So, when he saw no sign of the rose I'd promised to buy Mama, he was furious, believing with all his heart I'd broken his decades-long streak. I had to get a nurse from the hallway to convince him it was the 22nd, and he, of course, felt so badly for being upset with me. That's the only time I can really remember him being angry with me. He was hopelessly sentimental, preserving anything he was sentimental about at all costs of space, time, or money. This was no more apparent than when it was time to move them from their beloved cabin to an apartment. That experience taught me some lessons about keeping everything that I hope I remember in time to bless my own children. Daddy was a loyal friend. Once, one of his best friends, who was a diabetic, asked him to pick up a candy bar along with his insulin prescription. He assumed Daddy, who was also his doctor, would. Daddy just laughed in his face and, of course, said no. He was a prodigious eater. You'll remember that from the stories from Dulac you just heard. Daddy was very neat and tidy about himself, but was horribly messy with his belongings. He was a busy surgeon and doctor who never had to clean up behind himself. Mama never complained about the disarray always in his wake, but she did apologize a few times, not in his hearing. The most important legacy my father left to me was learning that God loves me personally and intimately, and that his love letter to us, the Bible, is true. I would like to conclude this closing by reading some of Daddy's own words. First, the beginning paragraph of his journal, which is called Musings of an Older Man, and then finishing with one of the many, many letters that he wrote to me. Here's the paragraph that he begins Musings of an Older Man with. Daddy says, "Seek comfort from the Lord, then from your close family, and then from your friends. Seek from the Lord first, because He is always close, even when physically you are alone. Seek comfort even when you don't need it. You can store it up against the days down the road." And I have found that to be true and amazing advice. And then this letter, it was written on April 17th, 1991. It's so formal. It's on his office stationery, and it even has my return address typed at the top, which I think is so interesting. But he says, "Dear Mary, enclosed is a new prescription for Mellaril. The amazing thing is that today is the day you called. The truth is that I took Mama's advice and wrote myself a note, which I discovered in my pocket when I was looking for something else. Anyway, here it is. I hope getting it when requested won't throw you into a decline of some sort. Today is too beautiful to spend in the office, but duty and all that. What I really need is a good excuse, and I would be long gone. Maybe I would catch a few fish. Who knows? Our new carport is coming along well, with 2 of Mr. Beachy's sons doing the work. It is a little unhandy having to furnish them transportation, but worth it to feel confident that they are knowledgeable and completely trustworthy. I have to mention here that Mr. Beachy's sons lived in the Amish community, which was 30 minutes away, so that was 2 trips every day that they came to work, month after month. Well, he says, in addition to the carport, they are going to dig under the living room chimney to pour a new footer and then build up to stabilize the chimney. It is settled about 3/4 of an inch, apparently from water leaking from the tile around the foundation of the house, which softened the dirt under the old chimney foundation. Life can occasionally be a bit complex. This will be expensive. But I would hate to see the chimney fall over in the yard. Our redwood and dogwood trees have been the prettiest this year that I can remember. The same is true in our entire area. Redbud is now beginning to fade, but the dogwood are still beautiful. Lots of wildflowers are still blooming. Crowfoots are gone, but spring beauties and anemones are still with us, as well as numerous different ones that we have transplanted into our front yard area. Sweet William is in full bloom, scattered over the woods too. We are so richly blessed to be able to still live in our beautiful woods. Not only has God never failed us, but He keeps granting such a profusion of blessings, not to mention our health and healing. I don't really have any news. We enjoyed going to Jane's last night for Chase's birthday party. I hope we will be able to see you all before too long. Take care, and don't go near the water. Love, Daddy. P.S. Give each girl a hug and a kiss for me. But you can skip Charlie. Give my love to Paul. But if you kiss him, it's on your own. Dad.